now streaming live on YouTube. So we're preparing to stream. There we go.
Hello, everyone.
Yes, I am
Hi.
to record. There it is. All right, how are we doing? Ostap is here.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Hi, Ostap.
Hi.
And Ed, looks like Ed is back.
Yep.
So just as we're kind of gathering the last critics joining, we wanted to have the critics introduce themselves at the outset before we move into the first project.
So let's start. Well, Eva, you're up there. Why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I'm Eva Perez Vega, professor of degree project with Gonzalo Carbajo, who could not join us at this point, but he'll be joining us at around 3 o'clock. Teaching degree project for a number of years with the office in New York City called the Precise Studio.
Okay, Daniela?
Daniela Fabricius. I teach history and theory at Pratt, and I also teach the HMS component of the degree project and worked with Lucy and Ted, and also with Eva and Gonzalo. And I'm a historian and also have some design background.
Dora?
Hi, I'm Dora Epstein-Jones. I'm the chair of architecture at Texas Tech and also an associate professor.
Tulay?
Hi, I'm Tulay Atak. I'm a professor of architecture at Pratt. I also teach at Cooper Union, so there too, thesis. So yeah, that's it.
Ostap?
Hi, Ostap. I teach first year and degree project at Pratt, and I also practice at Cloud's architecture office.
Great. And Lafina, is that the right way of pronouncing it? Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Lafina. I work at Moss the last almost 3 years. And before that, I've worked in Greece and in Denmark. And I also am a co-founder of a small studio in Athens called Atlis.
Ed?
Hey everybody, I am directing the Center of Transformative Media at the New School right now for the past few years, associate professor in School of Design Strategies and co-founder of AUM Studio with Carla Latau.
And then Vivian, I think that's you.
Yes, I'm actually not David Brown. I just signed up for another Zoom meeting using my colleague's registration. So there we go. Yeah. Thank you. I was like, why is David Brown in this thing, you know? Hi, I'm Vivian Lee. I'm the studio executive director at Woods Bagot. Just recently joined. Previously, I was a principal at Bridge & Meyer & Partners for the last 15 years, and I'm currently also the co-chair for Women in Architecture at the AIA New York.
Great. Michael.
Hi, guys. I'm Michael Caton. I'm an architecture discipline manager at WeWork and also a professor at Pratt, teaching in the first year core curriculum.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Anna, or Anna?
Hi, Michael.
Anna, or?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Anna Cajiao. I'm also a professor at Pratt Institute and alum as well. I have my own practice in Brooklyn, and for over a decade, I worked at Zaha Hadid Architects in London.
Frank, good to see you.
Hi, hey, Evan, hi. I'm Frank Giswaldi. I'm practicing architect in New York, teacher at Pratt, and an associate principal at Studios Architecture.
Great. Erica, I don't think you need to introduce yourself. You can just make
Hi.
same with Jason, who we can't see anyway. Yama.
Hi guys.
Looks like Theo David's here.
Great to be here. I am a partner at Studio Liebeskind. I used to teach Pratt for about 7 years, but that was like decades ago. Done some teaching at ATA as well, but delighted to be here.
Thanks for coming, Yama.
Theo?
Oh, I'm here. I'm just here as an observer.
Oh, please introduce.
And well, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Theo David, professor of architecture, many things. Anyway, I'm just here as an observer to see at least 3 of my wonderful students that are presenting today, including Lucy, who I think is the first one, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, she is.
Good luck to you all. Good to see you all.
And Alex, do you want to introduce yourself? You there? Where'd you go? There you are.
There he is.
Hi, everyone. Pierre DeLooz, or Alex DeLooz, faculty member in Humanities Media Studies at Pratt, and co-teaching this incredible studio with Evan and Cathryn. Good to see you all.
Hey, Alex.
Cathryn, we didn't introduce ourselves.
Oh, we didn't. I know. We were doing this only with jurors in the morning. So my name's Cathryn Dwyre. Teaching degree project with Evan and Alex, as previously mentioned. Been teaching it for some time at Pratt, as well as second-year studios, occasionally seminar, and co-principal in Numa Studio with Chris Perry.
I'm Evan Tribus, been teaching at Pratt since 2007, degree project since I think 2010 or 11, it's been quite a while. Associate at DeLooz Video on Intro, and excited to be here. So, did we miss anyone? I think we got the Hollywood squares.
Everybody.
We got everyone, awesome. All right, thank you so much. Just one protocol note that I'm sure everyone is used to now. Please mute yourself while the students are presenting so they can do their business. And I think we're starting, yes, with Ted and Lucy. You guys are here? Ted, there's Ted.
Yeah.
Great, take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to.
Oh, I'm sorry, Eva, yeah, you should introduce them, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just very briefly so we can get into the projects. But, our degree project section is called Human Cartographies, and we really started with this idea, and this was developed with Gonzalo, Carbajo, and Daniela Fabricius, around the idea that we architecture can have a critical and active role in the context of the global ecological crisis. So we started with the hope of kind of debunking the notion of human as dominating species and really questioning the role that architecture can play in breaking the prevailing assumptions of nature as something distinct from us humans and distinct from architecture and culture. So that's a broad kind of conceptual framework. Students, of course, in the fall develop a pretty in-depth directions of research that of course are based on research and issues of the day, but in most cases we delved into very kind of speculative future scenarios for the projects. The project you'll see today by Lucy and Ted called INC-CAP-SU-LA-TING certainly takes us into a kind of fantastic new world, but backed up with the research that was developed in the fall. So with that, I'm going to give the platform to Lucy and Ted.
Hello, my name is Ted.
And I'm Lucy.
And together we create the project INC-CAP-SU-LA-TING.
Humans have always been drawn to the unknown mysteries of the night sky. We have invested large amounts of resources to explore beyond our planet. Those incredible clouds of light couldn't attract people more, but we know little about identical marvels that exist here on Earth the species that inhabit the darkest zones of our ocean. We don't need to leave our planet to observe these creatures. We know more about outer space than we know about parts of our own planet. Only 5% of the ocean bed has been discovered by humans, and only 4 people have traveled to the deepest part, the Mariana Trench and the Pacific Ocean. Our project proposes a constellation of 5 capsules built from the refuse of the Pacific Ocean garbage patch, deployed at different depths of the ocean to clean, mitigate, educate, research, conserve, restore, and radically reconfigure human interaction with the ocean and its species. The surface of the ocean is familiar to humans. Long in our history, humanity explored this world through sailing and have learned about the currents and wind forces that exist in this incredible environment. Our project site is the dynamic and ever-changing Pacific Ocean, both its surface and its depth. We started by exploring the vertical and horizontal currents and how they interact with the wind forces. However, this free and open space without national borders has been gravely affected by humans. The Pacific Ocean is where the world's largest garbage patch is located. Due to the directions of global ocean currents, plastic is being concentrated into ocean gyres. There are 5 major garbage patches around the world. 2 of them are in the Pacific Ocean, and the one between Asia and North America is the largest one. This is what the garbage patch looks like. Plastic is one of the major environmental harms. This material cannot be decomposed, and only 20% of global plastic waste is recycled. The rest is burned, causing excessive CO2 emissions, stored in landfills, or dumped into rivers, from where it finds its way into oceans. It harms the ocean, the marine inhabitants, and also our coasts, and all other living species that depend on the ocean. According to a variety of scientists, historians, and ecologists, we're experiencing a 6th global extinction, where many species aren't able to adapt to the constantly changing environment. Plastic pollution is just one of the major issues causing this. Together, the garbage patches form the new continent on the surface of the ocean and create destroyed ecosystems on Earth. These are the 5 oceanic garbage patches in respective order. We modeled the patch in order to understand its mass and its density.
So the ocean is an interconnected system. The oxygen, depth, salinity, and current all affect each other. The concentration of garbage patches result from the current system, which can influence the local oxygen density of the ocean. When compared to Europe, the garbage patch is 3 times larger than France. Marine species also migrate through the oceanic system. Their travel path follow the local currents. Some of them have become endangered because of the plastic pollution. And this is a vertical section through our site, the Pacific Ocean. The species known to humans inhabited only the first kilometer of its depth. We do not know much about the creature who inhabited its mysterious depth. Our mission is to clean and preserve the surface of the ocean for the species that need to be saved now, and explore the depth of the ocean for life form we can learn from. Our architectural proposition is aimed at resolving the issue of garbage patches by collecting ocean plastic and recycling it into building material on site. Our project is not static, it moves cyclically. The proposed project moved from the east coast of Asia to the west coast of America across the Pacific Ocean. We started doing this by analyzing the 2-dimensional local currents and their motion and transform them into 3-dimensional forms. We created a simulated site to test out how the capsule will be affected by current, and in order to study the performance of this capsule on water. Then develop into the interior space of the capsule. In order to develop the interior, we'll look at the multiple layers of oyster. Each layer has its own function, which structurally hold the muscle in place and protect it from outer threats. We hybridized the study on the performance of the oyster with a physical model exploration of the interior space, which result in oval capsule that shelter different living things, including humans, algae, and marine species. The different capsule will float at different level of the ocean. Therefore, we integrate a vent bolus water system on top of the skin, which control the buoyancy of the capsule by taking in or releasing water. This technique comes from our experience with growing algae. We observe how algae is able to float vertically in space instead of laying flat. On the right is a vent system when it's flat, and on the left is a system flowing three-dimensionally on the skin. The transparency of the vent structure was created originally with a design to create area that could be habitat for a free relationship between two organisms, a photosynthetic microbe such as microalgae and compatible microbe. The photosynthetic microbe is able to convert sunlight to sucrose, which is consumed by the compatible microbes. Materials such as pigments and luminance scents then form. We have learned that several deep sea species use bioluminescence to communicate in order to attract prey or defend against predators. The same idea can be applied in a vent-like system to attract species who want to study or defend against potential threats. In order to stimulate this, we use quinine, which has a physical property of glowing in the dark. We then mix quinine with colored pigment to produce glowing liquid in different colors.
This is the elevation of capsules at the relative depth. Here you see the production facility, research center, education center, farming facility, and endangered marine species preservation center. These programs will be established and built on-site out of the recovered ocean plastic. They can also be combined in order to create hybrid programs. We will now take you through each capsule and the specific programmatic role that it plays. The first program is the production capsule. Its duty is to capture the plastic floating on the ocean surface and then process it into building materials such as plastic, bricks, 3D printing filaments, and plastic panels. Collected plastic waste would be directed into a shredder, which would tear up into smaller pellets, preparing them for recycling. The shredded plastic is then melted so it can be formed through robotic extruders. The heat compression type of recycling allows us to recycle all types of plastic at once. The major advantage of this process is that it does not require matching forms of plastic to be recycled together. Microplastics can go through an elaborate and accurate monomer recycling process, overcoming the major challenges of plastic recycling. This process not only purifies, but also cleans the plastic waste to create a new polymer. Those diagrams show how the production facility collects oceanic plastic. This process will allow a more accurate collection of plastic waste, which flows on or near the water surface. This is a detailed wall section for architecture that will be created by production facility. The two main systems will be 3D printed in order to create one constant. The first system is a thick 3D printed membrane, which performs as a skin layer that protects the capsule from the outside, while the other system is a structural vascular system, which would blend into the membrane as well as wrap the capsule around, holding it in shape. The second program is the farming facility. We will be growing algae and kelp in order to produce biofuel, food sources, and oxygen. Most importantly, algae will be the material that eventually replaces plastic. Kelp and algae are grown inside another capsule that is inside the farming facility. Humans can navigate the space between the exterior skin and the capsule for maintenance, observation, and collection of the kelp and algae. The tunnels between the capsule and exterior skin also structurally hold the capsule in place. The white hatches become the heart of the capsule, which contains mechanical equipment that keeps the farm running. We looked at specific precedents that recreate the surrounding environment underwater in order to apply the same technology to our programs. The third program is the Endangered Marine Species Preservation Center. There are many marine species whose lives are threatened because of human activity and the plastic patches. The goal is to provide an artificial environment that mimics the original habitats that are being destroyed, and to closely monitor them and help them grow back larger numbers. Sea turtles are the target marine species in this case. Again, there is a second capsule that is inside the Endangered Marine Species Preservation Center, which sea turtles and other marine species occupy. The relationship between the exterior and the capsule is similar to the farming facility, where the white hatches are the mechanical spaces that support the functionality of the capsule. The exterior skin protects sea turtles from their predators and pollution, and the fin-like structures controls the buoyancy. The bubbles that flows within the capsule are where sea turtles can lay their eggs. They mimic the condition of the beach that is suitable for reproduction. Sea turtles will be able to swim into one of those bubbles and safely lay their eggs without human intervention. The fourth program is the Research Center, where scientists are able to collect marine data and samples for research in the lab. Eventually, we hope that scientists will be able to fill out the unknown 95% of data about the ocean. Those are the early study forms of massing studies of the Research Center. Humans would occupy a separate capsule inside the Research Center. The laboratory, living space, offices, and working space are all inside the capsule. The lobby sits right in the middle. The non-working zones, such as living spaces, are on the top, and the working zones are at the bottom. Again, there is a protective, translucent exterior skin that is made out of plastic, and the vein-like structure that controls the buoyancy of the vessel. The fifth program is the Educational Center. After the garbage patch cleanup is finished, we still want this project to continue its purpose of maintaining a clean ocean. Therefore, we're including an educational facility to teach the next generation about the hard work that people have done to clean up the mess that humans had made in the past. This is the early form study section through the capsule that is inside the Education Center. We will be promoting knowledge of the oceans and teaching the public their duty to protect natural heritage. The education facility can also join with the research center to enrich the possibility of studying and practicing.
So we imagine our project developing in multiple stages. It will begin in 2050 with the production facility that collect the plastic from the patches and transform it into different type of building material for the construction of other vessels. Other programs such as the Environmental Preservation Center, Research Center, Farming Facility, and Education Center will be built in respective order. Several capsules can form a cluster which can join or disengage based on their mission. By 2070, the ocean will be free of plastic. Farming Facility and Environmental Preservation capsule will be mass produced before the project ends in order to prepare for the next stage. After 2070, the farming facility will keep growing kelp and algae. Our goal is to develop a way to replace the use of plastic with algae to completely eliminate plastic on Earth. Alternatively, kelp and algae can also be used as a food source or biofuel. The research center also works as a receptor to the education center, the farming facility, and the endangered marine species center. This project is a cluster of vessels in international water that works together to benefit not only human, but also other species that are important to this oceanic environment. We aim to detoxify the ocean by reconfiguring the material, plastic. Although we are encapsulating now to resolve the issue that humans have created, one day we will be decapsulating. Then we can eliminate the barriers between all living things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can, you're showing us some more work here, but we could probably open it up to discussion. Yes.
Well, maybe I'll jump in. You know, I think there was a period in the late 90s, early 2000s where like you couldn't say the word beautiful about architecture, like it was just wrong. I don't know, maybe it was gay, maybe it was feminist, who knows? But this is beautiful. It's beautiful, but that's not it, right? There's so much more here. I have a lot more to say, but just wanted to break open the ice.
Well, we love your chat stream. I think that's a lot of good things in that chat already. Do you want to, since I kind of interrupted your last, do you want to just put the last image that was rolling there? It was a GIF or something that you had, little video?
The video or the one before?
Just the very last video, yeah.
The
Just
video?
Animation, yeah.
This one, yeah.
That was Alex making the comment about beauty, wasn't it, Alex?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because one of the notes that I was taking during your presentation, folks, was with projects like this, I often remember an old Jimi Hendrix track, which is called 1984, A Merman I Should Turn to Be. And it's, if you haven't heard it, it's totally worth listening to, but for two reasons. One, it imagines a kind of a post-apocalyptic going under the sea, being surgically and technologically modified to breathe water, etc. And, you know, Jimmy's kind of commentary above it is, you know, well, you all said we couldn't do this, but here we go. You know, we make love in the sand before we go underneath the surface and leave the blasted heath above. But the more interesting part of that track to me is the soundscape. Like, Hendrix was such a genius on his less conventional musical tracks with creating this evocative sonicscape. And sure, it sounds a little bit like you're going underwater, but it also sounds like you're going into space. And it sets up the kind of ground for imagining a really different relationship between the human and the non-human. So it's an ambience, you know, it's a feel that you get in that. And one of the things that came to mind during your presentation also for me was the question of cohabitation and symbiosis, and what it means when you create a space for the human and the non-human to have meaningful exchanges. You know, if you have the turtles, for example, being afforded spaces where they can lay their eggs, etc., that's one way of doing it. Then there's like the finer grained aspect of cohabitation. Certain squid species are bioluminescent, but they're bioluminescent because they have a creature living inside them, a bacteria which grows at a certain pace. And every 24 hours, I think, or so, they purge. And so it's a remarkable kind of cycle of densification, pressure, accumulation, purging, literally exchanging into the surrounding oceanic atmosphere, environment, and so forth. And so I feel like on a lot of levels, your project is taking on those levels of exchange, those scales of exchange, all the way down to the molecular, because that's in a way what the project is predicated on. It's a kind of a conversion, a recapitulation of the materials that are available, and a conversion of them to something that's non-harmful, non-toxic, and useful. And I feel in that sense, like maybe it would be interesting to imagine a general economy in relationship to your project. You know, and I use that term in the loaded sense that George Bataille used it, as a way of thinking through both ecology and political economies and, quote, economies of currency. And I wonder, in your project, you've mapped out very beautifully this kind of material ecological set of plateaus and exchanges. I wonder if there's a way of fitting that into a kind of a global economy. You know, and science fiction takes this on really well, like William Gibson's Peripheral. It only has a short passage, but it imagines a community of people who are garbage patchers, who live on converted plastic garbage floating, and they have their own kind of cargo cult / subculture. And they play only a very small role in that novel, but it's a really interesting short snapshot of William Gibson's imaginary of what a kind of post-singularity subculture might be in relationship to the garbage patch. And there's an economic and a political component built into that. So I feel like finding places where the cohabitation, the chemical, molecular, and ecological could link up with political and cultural imaginaries is a really interesting space in your project. And maybe you could say, hey, wait, we're going to let the users figure that one out. Like we're dealing with the chemical, the molecular, the ecological, the material, and the human animal relations, but we're gonna let the political economies and so forth just kind of emerge. and that would be fine if you wanted to say that. But I only mention it because it comes to mind. The only other two comments I have, one is a reference to another science fiction work by Peter Watts called the Rifters Trilogy, where he essentially imagines a deep sea energy production facility, which unfortunately brings some, I believe it's bacteria, to the surface, which then precipitate a global collapse of agriculture. And of course, we're living through something which is not exactly that, but certainly planetary in its scale and hopefully not planetary in collapse. And so I wonder if you could look into the ways that as you drop deeper and deeper into the unexplored layers of the ocean, you could prepare for discovering not things like giant squid, but dormant or relatively inaccessible biomes, which then would integrate with your project or have potential consequence above the surface. And then I think your timeline could be faster. I mean, think about the fact that right now SpaceX is already building a small fleet of starships so that they can get both off planet and also get us to Mars. Whether that's a good idea or not, we can talk about. Or other mainstream endeavors like Y Combinator, which are funding projects not so dissimilar to yours. So I think your timeline into the 2060s, et cetera, 2050s, I think it could be accelerated substantially, given the dreadful state of the planet that we're in right now.
Hi, this is Dora. Hi, Ed. By the way, I will never have as many literary references as Ed. I don't think anybody does. So that said, this very interesting provocation about, and that Ed is bringing up about the kind of ecological stakes. Can you stay on that slide? Actually, stay on that slide. The ecological stakes of this, which to me, okay, Elon Musk the other day with his child who's named this great name, X-Ash A12, or in that he was wearing a t-shirt that said Occupy Mars. And I immediately had this negative reaction because I was like, oh my God, it's colonialism all over again. And then I thought, okay, well, yeah, but who are the abject? Who's the colonial abject when you occupy Mars? And so I would say here, this is a kind of colonization, even though it's a mitigation colonization project. And so I'm wondering a little bit about the abject population, which is whose land is being occupied here. And I see that we're mitigating that oceanic environment by turning the garbage into some other thing, and that some other thing is supposed to be also mitigating that environment. But I wonder if there isn't a kind of architectural move that could respond more productively to the abject who is colonized and kind of reframe the abject colonization discourse a little bit. So for example, if you go back, sorry, the slide that you were on, that I was saying, with the divers inside, and it looked like Rainer Banham's bubble with the mechanization there. Yeah, that's it. The smooth exterior of this bubble, I don't know if smoothness is not a kind of Western conceit of the surface of a wall, and the smoothing of the apparatus from the exterior. I think the biome and paying attention to the biomes there would probably mean that you'd have to make all kinds of little crevices, and there would be a kind of intricacy of the exterior surfaces such that this marine life could be given these occupational territories that are on top of the mitigation of the plastic and the plastic in that environment. And what's really cool about like melting the plastic and reforming it and everything is that it doesn't have to obey the surface tectonics and surface structures of, you know, say the Western, you know, imperial sense of smoothness. It could take on all of these. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an agate, right? You know, a kind of geode. In fact, if you look at a geode with an agate in it, it's really crumbly on the outside. And so I wonder if that wouldn't be a little kind of extra, there might be an amenity to this project, but I think it might be an important way to consider the both andness of the environment, both from the interior out and the exterior in.
Those are really great comments. I will not contend on a level of eloquence here, but at the outset, let's face it, this project is motivated by self-preservation, right? So we're concerned about the ocean because ultimately we're concerned about ourselves, and so what I hear, what is the economy of this project, and I do understand that it's beyond just monetary economy, and how does this contribute? Going back to the ocean, I mean, there's something very provocative about the idea of returning to life, where to the source of life. We're actually going backwards. But I'm a little bit skeptical about so much focus on the science part of it, because I think the science is very speculative, and I think it's the project's merit, at least at our level, is beyond the science, the speculative science. But what do we discover in pursuit of saving the earth or saving the oceans? What did we discover? Did we discover a new real estate? Did we discover a new atmosphere? Did we discover a new opportunism that focuses on a new way of life, a new atmosphere? So less about the scientific kind of mechanisms and more about, well, you stumbled upon an incredible new atmospheric kind of real estate that you could occupy. It's another kind of occupation in another kind of world. So I guess my only thing is to focus a little bit more on the qualities of life and what would attract and what would make this kind of a venture sustainable and desirable. Because it shouldn't just be predicated on sort of philanthropy or on the idea of the good or doing good, because that usually has its limits. How does this become something desirable? And how does this become a new kind of a new real estate that is truly fantastic? I think it's there. I think there's a lot of a lot in your presentation and your design ability that's already suggestive of an incredibly fantastic world. I guess my suggestion is to now focus more on the atmosphere of life here rather than on the science.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of those themes. Although I'll admit I disagree on a few. I would disagree with the suggestion to kind of make it marketable as like an experience or like a new kind of real estate territory. But this question of who does it serve, and that conservation or remediation of the oceans is really it's something that we do in our own self-interest. I think that's happens when I think we're pushed to certain extremes where certain life-sustaining resources are in such short supply that we have no choice but to clean up the ocean so that certain essential resources for our own sustenance can continue to flourish and flow. But I struggle a little bit with both the scale. First of all, I should say beautiful project, right? But with that said, I struggle with the scale of the project and the scope of the project in somewhat inverse ways. as you guys are going through your presentation, you mentioned that the garbage patch is about 3 times the size of France. But then in your proposal, in these series of pods, something about the scale of the solution, of the proposed solution, doesn't seem to match the scale of the required work to kind of remediate like this condition, right? But then simultaneously, I think in terms of the scope of the project, at least just some of the things that I picked up on, and I might have missed one or two, but that these pods are really about exploration, education, remediation, and conservation in different ways and happening at different points on the surface or at the depths of different depths in the ocean. And I think the scope of the project being so broad opens up so many avenues and tentacles to contend with that I would argue aren't being contended with in ways that I think missed out on some of the really potent possibilities within your project. For instance, on this very slide that you have up here, I believe here's where you guys are talking about melting plastic and kind of creating the vessels and things of that nature. How do you really dig, if you were to kind of really focus in on the scope of like just that process, right? The actual construction, the melting, the heat that's created, what does that do to the kind of microclimates? How do you begin to maybe use that heat for other things? How do you begin to like internalize that energy to begin to, in a more focused manner, to open up the possibilities of the act of remediating this territory, right? And I feel as though when we get into visitor centers, divers, conserving turtles, it happens, for instance, that you can have turtles that kind of swim into this vessel and are protected from man-made effects, pollution. However, right, those turtles also provide vital sustenance to other aspects of like the ecosystem, right, the marine ecosystem. So how do those things begin to interact? Like, I think about pretty, I think, ingenious conservation project where there was essentially some fish species that were cut off from their migratory paths because of a dam, and some folks created basically a chute that would take fish from the lower portion of the dam and kind of shoot them up to the upper portion. However, there was using AI and machine learning and also camera technologies, they would scan the fish that would come into a certain vessel, and if that fish, based on a kind of a larger data set, kind of passed the test that it should actually be on this migratory route, it then went into the tube and was shot up over the dam. And if it wasn't supposed to go up to that stream, it then went through like a side hatch that kind of left it where it was supposed to be, right? How do you begin to kind of dig into these issues that come up, right, when you're introducing these kinds of technologies and construction and the things that come with it? And not that it will kind of diminish the fantastical and wonderful nature of your project, but that it begins to deepen and strengthen the robustness of the proposals and the issues that you're contending with. And I also just think about something pretty basic with the tectonics of depth, pressure, transparency that you desire or when you don't desire it, right? How do the structures begin to, what kind of systems are you creating, right, to begin to navigate that across these different vessels? And while at the outset, I said that I struggled a bit with this scale and the program, I would love to see a more intensive investigation of a limited set of programs, but a dramatic scaling up of your thinking in terms of how the solution can be deployed, you know, and whether it's aggregate systems, et cetera, and maybe they're deployed in different oceans depending on the scale of the cleanup, and also thinking about how these structures could then be used once like the cleanup is quote finished. It was also a thing that I was thinking about, what does kind of finished look like? Or is this just something that becomes part of our marine kind of landscape that's continuously helping us to have a more symbiotic relationship where we try to reduce pollution, but at the same time we're cleaning things, but there's never quite a done moment. But all in all, it's a really wonderful project and lots to dig into and to talk about here.
If I may follow up on the scale and on the structure of the previous comments, if I try to see this project in a very abstract way, we're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we have, which is very vast, and we have these vessels randomly put, and these vessels create another empty space in them. So somehow we have this like empty space in the empty. So it creates some kind of double negative there. And I'm wondering whether these are perhaps bubbles that they float or they're anchored somewhere, or how does that work? And I'm wondering also about the form, because you mentioned something about oysters in the beginning, and that the oyster itself has like a shell and has the empty part in it with the organism. So, but in yours, I see many layers. So I was wondering perhaps if you would like to talk a little bit more about the form itself and how do you imagine these structures to stand on in your site in the sea. Talking about the students.
Yeah, should we listen more to comments, or should we start addressing some of them right now? How would this work best?
I mean, I know there's some things you could address, but because we're limited in time, I don't know, maybe just address this last comment, but hopefully we have some more time for comments too.
Okay, yeah, I can quickly reply on the last one in terms of how it's played. So, Ted, if you can go to the slides that's at the very beginning about the current, I think, yeah, 21 or slide 9. So based on the study of the currents on the ocean, we realized that it's better for the project to migrate through the ocean. And to use that, we're going to use like local forces such as oceanic gyres, and they're like circular currents in the ocean. And we did a calculation that it will take, I think, 60 to 80 days for a one-way trip from like, for example, in this case, from Asia to North America, just using the local currents. So it will be like a circular movement where it will be like a continuous, well, yeah, a circular continuous movement, also kind of cleaning the ocean on its way and building it up. And in terms of scale, we did a calculation that we need 16 vessels. I think, Ted, if you can address that one.
Yeah, so to answer the question of scale, so there will be not only one cluster, but many cluster. And when I say cluster, it includes Research Center, Marine Preservation Center, and Farming Facility. And each of them will have 15 production capsule that will collecting the plastic. And where there will be a total of 20 cluster that will be launched in the 5 different plastic jars. And this calculation is done based on the ocean cleanup project that we research on. So yeah, our production facility is fairly small, but there will be numerous of them that's launched to the ocean and cleaned up at the same time. So that's how we will be done this project. And in terms of the form, we're trying to tackle the idea of multi-layers of the skin. So there's like performance on the skin, because how we allowed research on the oyster. So the idea is that there will be several layers. And for example, the first layer we're talking about is the protection layer, that it's similar to the shell, which is similar to the shell on the oyster. And there will be another layer, the kind of skeleton structure they're looking at, which is controlling the buoyancy. And that will also structurally hold, ideally will structurally hold the egg that you see in the middle in place. But also the water will still allowed to flow in between the capsule and the exterior skin. So there's like a multifunctionality of the exterior skin that we learn from the oyster that's deployed at of the form that we design. And the interior of the capsule itself is meant to be a kind of a safe zone for all species, including humans and include plants or the marine species. So the kind of in between layer is kind of what protected them from the outer threats.
So I think that the use of this sort of egg-like shaped structure is very smart, because I assume, obviously, in terms of the currents and the sort of thrashing that this object is going to take, it just makes for perhaps a more efficient and successfully geometric form that would deal with that, let's say. And as most people have said, it's an amazing project, so I congratulate you on that. My question is, when we get into the nitty-gritty of the program, right? We're still, I guess I'm still not quite understanding how internally the program is being disseminated, right? And trying to understand exactly how would humans inhabit that space. The moment it seems a bit more conducive for the marine life that can kind of easily adapt to what's there, but for actually the people who are doing the research and such. And I just wondered if perhaps that, I don't know if you did show a slide that showed us maybe a section through one of the laboratories of this sort of space.
It's in this one. But the white hatches you see are cutting a section through inhabitable spaces.
But I don't know if they're clear enough to kind of convey that idea. And I think it's important, right? We've touched upon the theoretical and all these other great aspects of where the concept was born from. But now if you're really trying to understand how it functions as a space to inhabit, you need to address that at some point. And I think that hasn't really been addressed. But it's there. I mean, you have basically the form work. It's just really getting more in depth, I think, in terms of detail, and just even if it's a section of one area that you truly identify and you study, that needs to be shown and developed, I would say.
Okay, yeah. But we did a study of how circulation, human circulation could go through the research center, where we identified that because we are mainly researching marine species like algae and marine life, as well as doing the studies of the unknown depth of the ocean, we realized that at the bottom of the vessel would be kind of taken by the program of the research centers, such as labs and spaces that to perform the research, and where the top part would be the living part for scientists and the team of professional divers and the team of researchers.
I think this is a good point that Anna's making, that we're not, we did talk about it and it was there, but we're not seeing it now, right, in terms of a drawing that kind of conveys that. But I'd love to give some time maybe to someone who hasn't spoken. Frank, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you want to share any comments. You have about 7 minutes left.
Yes, hey, thank you, Eva. No, I'm enjoying the comments and trying to sort of get a sense of where the students, Ted and Lucy, land in this distinction between perhaps an engineering kind of project, something between sort of large scale industrial design or sort of systems thinking, sort of engineering project where we're talking about, I mean, the program we were just talking about in these last couple of moments was housing and research oriented spaces, which of course would happen here. But I'm also then wondering about the previous comments about human life outside of the sort of functional or the kind of necessary for sustaining, minimum, kind of just sustaining sort of the minimum levels of life needed to actually perform the job, versus celebratory spaces for communal life to happen. It's not clear to me exactly what type of deployment this has, if this is sort of going like on a space voyage where you're at sea or adrift for long periods of time away from family, et cetera. And so therefore, are there these other kinds of communal spaces and spaces of sort of let's say, spaces that aren't just about fulfilling a kind of function, but are more about a kind of life that you imagine sort of growing or taking place over time in these deployments. And that might be best told in a kind of planimetric drawing that starts to talk about sequences through kind of public squares or plazas within the interior environment of these bubbles, or what happens in that space between the kind of have a kind of multi-layered set of membranes or skins or liminal spaces between hard systems and soft systems, and wondering what kinds of activities and modes of daily life would happen in these more, let's say, exotic spaces between layers. And so maybe that's a question for the students, or maybe we leave it a little bit open. It does seem to sort of resist getting into that level of scale and exploration, because it's really taken, I think, the students up to now, and it's a beautiful presentation, a lot of work has been done. It's taken, I think, this amount of time just to sort of set the parameters of the project. But I would love to know more in terms of, you know, Ed was bringing up science fiction earlier. I want to watch this movie. I want to know who the characters are. I want to know what kinds of relationships are forged, what kinds of animosities are taking place between, you know, the characters in this movie, and sort of inhabit a little bit more the inner kind of conceptual thinking of these interior spaces, even just through the kind of taking of perspective views of the interior. I'm sort of missing that more cinematic layer, perhaps, because we are sort of staying at this sort of large sectional kind of scale. And I think I would say, in addition to that, you know, I heard it's in some of Michael's comments as well, this idea of feedback, which I think was a missed opportunity. I think there's a really skillful development of the design of the project that then gets sort of deployed out into the world. And I think it's only now starting to be tested in terms of what changes, what sort of evolutions might occur to the system, if in fact it is sort of pliable at all, or able to be kind of modified or recalibrated over time. How might feedback, whether it be simply by sort of the mechanics of the pressure of the water, the infestation or inhabitation of new species, microclimates developing, heat being generated, changing local microclimates, how might that be then fed back into the architecture to almost watch it evolve over a greater time scale? I think those things are probably a potential next step of exploration. And so less a series of questions and more just observations. Again, number one, is it an engineering project or is it a kind of architectural project? And number two, is there a time element, a sort of time scale that could be designed into the project to map its potential for transformation and evolution?
Could I build off that? And I'd like to try to connect some of the other comments. Do we have time?
We have a few minutes. Couple minutes. Oh, not really. I would say, yeah, closing comment, I guess.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to applaud both of you designers for reminding us that architecture has the ability to visualize things in powerful ways that allow us to ask important questions of the present. To me, this is truly a speculative project in a future-oriented speculative project, in that what is being conserved isn't so much the way we wish the oceans were, but it's more how the oceans should be in a future that is truly been marked by the presence of human beings on the planet. And so, you know, I really encourage you to think about your project through the lens of writers like Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway. there's a way in which the differentiation between species, which we hold so dearly onto, is going to fall apart. And there's a way in which this project shows that in its biomimicry, in the inability to sort of distinguish between the sort of figures and the grounds and the renderings. And, you know, and I think everything from the data visualization to the atmospherics of the renders allow us to ask really important questions about whether or not this is scientific, whether or not this is architectural. I think it's all of it. And that's what makes it, in some senses, science fiction in the best sense of the term. So I really enjoyed the project and what it invites me to consider. Congratulations.
Agreed.
Thank you.
So I know we're kind of running out of time. I mean, I know we took some time for introductions. If I know, Lafina, you didn't get a chance to say anything, but if there's like a 1 minute, some comment you want to have, or otherwise we'll move on to the next project because we don't want to take extra time. Should I?
I think that I think the project is very nice presented in a way that it supports the research that has been done, and I really like this idea of like these new organisms somehow that you create and that they float in the sea, they go along the waves, and they create their own life in them. And somehow this is also, it has other functions. So I would say that by creating new life that seems to me, as I follow your presentation, that kind of belongs there already, that is a success for me. And yeah, that is the biggest thing I have to say.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up here. I just to commend the two of you for a tremendous amount of work, but also kind of delving into the unknown this way and sort of taking us on this incredible ride. It was very strong, kind of interesting partnership between Lucy's project at the beginning was very non-human, very other species oriented, and Ted, you were very, very sort of more human. And I think we managed to get a really strong project out of the partnership. So thank you all for the amazing comments. Really, it's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good job, guys.
Good job, guys. Nice work.
In the crossover, I don't know if they're going to jump off, but just one thing, your project was so wonderful and the conversation was so wonderful. I totally forgot about the whole context that we were in quarantine, and or that anything happened that we had to shift to remote learning. And I think that's a testament to the strength of the work that you guys have done and your resilience in this whole process.
I'm happy that happened. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
All right, Cathryn, we're up.
Yes. Okay, so we're gonna move into Serra and Sabrina's project. And Evan and I are from the section called Future Publics. And that is what it sounds like. And we're asking, the whole group had very different takes. There was certainly interest in future prospects, including climate crisis, physical versus non-physical environments, and all couched in the very potent question that seems even more so right now about what is going to be the future of public space. Anything you want to add, Alex or Evan?
Just quickly that, I've said this before, Cathryn and our meta thematic is the disciplinary hybrid of landscape and architecture. As part of the research, one of the major thematics underneath that was exploring ground, both conceptual and actual, as a host, let's call it, for public space, both conventional and speculative, and notions of deep section, which is let's say the performative nature of those things that are typically found underground or way above ground. So those are some of the thematics in addition to those that that Cathryn already mentioned, and that's all I think we need to really say about our kind of thematics. So yeah, oh, and I think it was mentioned before, but Alex DeLooz, who's on, was our writing partner, but really our third critic and really amazing contributor. So, Sarah, Sabrina, go ahead.
Hello, okay.
Hi, I'm Serra.
And I'm Sabrina Tedino, and this is our project, Haha, Let 100 Sexes Bloom. So we looked at many examples of public space at the beginning of the semester, ranging from Disneyland to Ground Zero. For us, a problem that became really interesting was the idea of participation and social engagement. In fact, two different examples that we looked at were the vessel and Ground Zero. We noticed that even though the vessel is a sculpture that drives people into Hudson Yards, participation is limited to a self-experience where you go there, you circulate through the stairs, take a picture and leave. Meanwhile, looking at the example of Ground Zero, we noticed that when such tragic event happened, it drove people into the space to help one another. So many forms of participatory action were put in place. And that's why we wanted to focus on the idea of events and how important they are to organize social relationships and social gatherings. So we came up with this critique that current New York public space lacks participation, inclusivity, and interaction to explore and further develop our social relationships and social constructions.
We argue that a solution to create more participation in public space is through events. Events organize social relationships because they disrupt collectivity and forms of gathering. Events are opportunities to create new forms of gathering, allow people to engage and express themselves. Historical and cultural references of events that we have looked at are salons, Paris is burning, and other types of gatherings.
So we came up with the critique that can designing for events reinvent our culture's value in order to change the normative, including normative public space?
So the salon became the main focus as a space for collective participation. Salon incubates ideas and discourses that can modify the world. This timeline seeks to show how the typology of the salon has changed throughout time, maintaining its character to reunite people collectively in one space. We will further discuss the Gertrude Stein Salon, the Xenofeminism Salon, to further propose our 22nd century salon. So the Gertrude Stein Salon reinvented cultural values in the 1930s. It represented a radical inclusivity within the elite group of avant-garde artists, thinkers, and intellectuals. Even though it was exclusive in terms of an elite group in itself, it represented a publicness in terms of ideas exchange. This is queer culture, and they're more interested in what people have to say creatively than their sexual orientation.
We wanted to look at a current day salon, which is Xenofeminism. It is based on the idea of gender abolitionism. That's why our title is a quote from their manifesto, Let 100 Sexes Bloom. As you can see in this image, it is a virtual salon since it is a total of 6 members that are located in different parts of the world, but they're connected together virtually to participate. And the beliefs of xenofeminism for us were really important because it allowed us to project our future scenario. To the left, you can see the 2 main ideas that we extracted from their manifesto and that had shaped our research. And to the right column, you can see how we predict future public space needs to operate. In fact, public space for us needs to be a safe space for people to express themselves and their individuality along with others. And public space should be an open source to provide all the occupants with technology.
So this diagram represents how we are taking the 2 aspects of the salon and turning them inside out to create our 22nd century salon. The diagram on the left is a Gertrude Stein salon representation showing the hard boundary and exclusivity. The right is our inside out proposal where we are exposing the salon into a landscape creating visual and physical access to space. The hybrid nature of our salon, mixing the virtual aspect to the physical, and as well as after looking at the series of events, made us question the possible, program possibilities for the 22nd century salon. With such motivation, we wanted to play the surrealist games to explore programmatic hybrids that challenge the modes of collectivity. The programs have been pulled out from the salons that we have looked at in our research and played the games in order to rethink the programs of our 22nd century salon. So you write the names of the program, then put them in a bag, take out the programs from the bag and write them accordingly. And the right column is the ones that show the results of the game.
So what is our future scenario? Imagine the year 2120, there is no differentiation between gender, class, and sex. Although we become enhanced humans with multiple identities, technology is not enough to re-explore and determine who we are in the presence of the other. So our 22nd century salon becomes a public space alien to today's time. It is neither a landscape nor a building. It is a scenographic landscape that seeks to heighten our social relationships. The project exposes activities of the salon inside out in a series of multiple grounds knitted together through landforming. For us, scenographic is an important word because it describes the way we're using spectacle and special effects as a medium through which we design scenes and generate new value.
Spectacle and creating a scene is something that we have explored in the fall research. We invested our time in the understanding of the multiplicity of the ground, understanding what different features it can have in terms of size, scale, and material.
We develop our method in order to design scenes and generate new value. We use drawing as a design process to explore the multiplicity of ground. As a first step, we analyze armature landforming ramps and areas of occupation. In our interest to explore the multiplicity of ground, we produce experimental drawings that play with the idea of perspective and sectional splits between the physical grounds and the virtual grounds. Through creating this drawing, we found new spatial outcomes in terms of modes of circulation and occupation.
The drawing shows the possibility of the ramp flowing across the multiple grounds and always moving through spectacle scenes. The ramp becomes both a physical armature and a virtual one. For us, in the future, accessibility is for differently abled bodies. So ramps become conveyor belts with changes with orientation and trajectory. So these drawings start as a design process experimentation, but end up becoming the design itself. They become the site of experimental nature where colors represent space for visual and participatory activity.
So as you can see in these drawings, here the ramp engages between the physical space and the virtual space. This space specifically is called imagination trigger, and it triggers imagination through participatory storytelling, collective games, and discussions that are going to be broadcasted in the virtual screens. And also through the virtual grounds, we try to bring people together in the same space. For example, in this area, how we're bringing people from different geographic locations so that they can input themselves in the salon.
So evaluating the possibility of this drawing method to become the design of our 2120 salon, we further explored its integration as a whole at the site.
So we chose Randall's Island in New York City as the site of our project. We located the proposal on a site to give a degree of resistance to this experiment. The reason we chose Randall's Island is because it is a very interesting hybrid between an island that is highly connected in terms of transportation, but that has a history of being used to isolate people.
So Randall's Island in the 19th century used to be a place for undesirable people where asylums and prisons were located. The Park Aliens was created in the effort of community growth and is a high connected location by giving access to pedestrians, ferry, and buses. We have read Dreaming Tongues by Stuart Munro, who said that the landscape is spectator and the island is the examining table. So Randall's Island becomes a location where we would create the experiment for our 2120 salon, and the mainland would be the spectator. We want to acknowledge its past as a place of separation and turn it into a space that celebrates participatory efforts and community growth.
So for us, it's very important to understand the relationship of our project to the imposing bridge of Randall's Island and its visual relationship to Manhattan. The virtual projections are created in the efforts to them being extended to the height of the bridge and allow a wider visual accessibility to the mainland. So as we mentioned before, this is a fitness test that allows the generative drawing process and design to evolve and change. This drawing shows how the salon can grow over time and reach the audience of the mainland. It shows the multiple forms of connectivity from the virtual inputs of the salon to the intersection between the bridge and the circulation of the salon itself. Continuing exploring the nature of the participatory nature of the salon, we created programmatic spaces based on the surrealist games and the amount of people that will engage in such spaces. So as you can see here, the change of occupancy. And what I'm showing to you right now are blown up examples of how the plans operates and begin to integrate with our scenographic logic of color, landscape, and ramp, suggesting the scale of the engagement and also the spatial flow.
So we are not looking at the conventional architectural drawing, and then the spaces aren't a resolution conventional architectural drawings. So this space is called Zina Forest. It is the entry to the salon, our alien gate. These are experimental logic works. The ground splits, creating multiple ramps as access points to leading to main activity area. So, and the ramps as well flowing outwards into the next salon events. Different shades of color represent forms of occupation. Here is where the visitors are first introduced to salon topics of discussion projected on the virtual screen.
This place is called Sino-ID. This is the space where occupants have access to technology. In this study, the ground splits and the ramp flows across space, and that makes it be the main programmatic location for this space. The ramp becomes a personalized assembly line where occupants can physically transform themselves into their desired self. This process is the very bloom of the salon, and because it's such an important space, it is meant to be seen physically and also virtually through the projection screens. This space is called Sinotalk, and it is a multi-purpose space for performances, discussions, and entertainment. Multiple participatory activities happen simultaneously in this space at different elevated grounds, all connected by a center bridge. The bridge is the key visual and physical access to the multiple grounds in this space, but it also can be can allow a program to happen.
So this interview shows the porosity of the ground and how it is experienced in a way that every ground is spectacle. Experiential collage represents how the screen and the technology can invite people into the space and create a conversation in Zino-ID. To the right, you can see how the people can start the transformation, whether it is by costume or prosthetic. Vision that in the future people can look as we progress into this digital era and new social relationships. The virtual screen becomes a part of the program where it shows the virtual network of people from other parts of the world connecting into the activities happening in the salon. From this view, you can see the multiplicity of the ground and the viewing areas from the ground above. This is a visualization of how the salon works sectionally using armatures to support the movement of the ground.
So by designing a 2120 salon, we create inclusive and participatory public space. The exclusivity of the salon is inverted by setting it up in a landscape scenario. The scenographic landscape allows us to connect people visually, physically, and virtually through needing multiple grounds to one another. And given the experimental nature of our project, even though we may not know what the future looks like, we do know that as our social relationships keep evolving and keep growing, so will our salon keep blooming. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna jump in because as soon as you showed this, sorry, obviously amazing work, but let's just get straight to it. But as soon as you showed this process of moving from the salon to this open space, I think, did you use the word landscape?
Yeah, for us it's scenographic landscape, but yeah, landscape would be the way that we're exposing the activities of the salon.
Okay. But it's interesting because I immediately started to think about places like the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, the English Garden to some extent in Munich, like kind of big landscape places where whether it's like in a queer context or in other contexts, but there's been these abilities to create a system of codes and communication to have a kind of separate private space within that landscape. And I think that the nature or the natural aspect of the landscape was an important part of that. So I want to know more about, and I also looked at this and saw a lot of burly marks in your design. And I'm curious about the, I guess the landscape part of landscape, the questions of nature or the questions of, I'm always looking for places where there's less visibility, where there's there's a little more, there are moments of privacy that the landscape sort of makes possible.
Yeah, so like indeed, before our midterm research, we looked at Burl Marx examples and we actually studied him too. And that was something that kind of drove us, like the ground experiments that we were trying to do with the sectional work that we were exploring. And also in the interior renderings in the slide 43. So like how the landscape and the ground is used kind of shows the visibility of the people, and both like virtually and physically.
I would add to that in terms of handling ideas of privacy, for us, it became this kind of studies of occupancy of people and like the engagement, the nature of the engagement. But we did think that we wanted to create this idea of radical inclusivity. So it was more about the addition of these studies and being able to welcome greater amounts of people rather than maybe exploring more private kind of spaces.
Because I just wonder if like somehow the relationship between those two could almost foster more inclusivity, that you need kind of both sides of the coin. So that's, I don't know, I'm sort of still like looking for that in the project, like what isn't, if there's anything that isn't a performance, if there's something, a sort of another side to it as well, just to give it also more complexity, I think.
Yeah, so as for the landscape approach, Sabrina, if you can go to the full research drawings that we made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like we have the landscape and explored them as like plans and placing them as like upside down in slide 21. And so it was something that we were exploring more in the fall, and like the way that it was translated in the spring semester was in the idea of the ground conditions.
This is Frank. Hi. Do you guys, for the students, do you have a critique of other public spaces, or whether you know, successful or not successful, that you see as this proposal responding to? I'm trying to understand a little bit more how one designs for inclusivity and curates its and shepherds its success. For example, you know, what differentiates, just in terms of the landscape kind of island aspect of this, what differentiates a project like this from, say, the revitalization or the kind of reprogramming of Governor's Island, for example, or some of the, you know, I mean, Roosevelt Island is a little bit of a different situation, but you know, are you looking at other, I don't know if you've had any precedent work in this presentation that I missed, or have looked at some, I'm sure, landscape projects or other kinds of public projects, whether contemporary or you know, very, very kind of old examples of public space. For example, you know, what Central Park was when it was first kind of proposed, and or Prospect Park, and how this space sort of learns from or reacts against other projects that have come before it, and how one begins to kind of ensure the exclusivity that you're looking for in this project.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer that. Yes, we did look at many examples of public spaces. We did it in the fall semester, and we looked at Park Güell, or yeah, we look at Disneyland from a lens of also being a public space, but and we also went to like social kind of aspects of public space, being the house style architecture. Like we just thought that the way that we wanted to approach this was by culture or events as a way to really make people engage with one another. For us, that meant that was the search for the inclusivity. It was more about like a cultural motivation. That's why we went more in depth with analyzing the events. But we did also kind of notice, being Ground Zero, one of the main public spaces that we looked at. We also saw Financial District, kind of like public streetscapes. And yes, but it ended up being a little bit a result of noticing moments like the furniture, or how hostile the architecture can be, or in terms of time, how limited the time is to be in such spaces. I guess that's why we wanted to look at it more in terms of culture and events as being the drivers of that inclusivity.
I think that's a good point. I think maybe that's a little bit what I'm missing. I certainly enjoy this project and applaud its ambitions and the results that you have at the end of the semester. Now, I'm always, I think, one to look for a little bit more literal kind of specificity when it comes to the agency of architecture as a kind of physical design practice, and maybe a catalog of what you just termed aggressive architecture. And I think that's a great way to begin to sort of look at contemporary spaces as sort of, and what ingredients begin to inhibit things like crowd control, security measures, so-called kind of security measures that begin to keep gatherings a certain size. I love this idea that you just brought up about making sure people don't stay in certain spaces for too long. In other words, sort of move along kind of measures where there's a kind of a policing of public space. I think that is a detriment to the kind of event scape that you're trying to engender here. And then what the opposite of that would be. In other words, what would be the anti-version of that? And from a very kind of physical, like space kind of point of view, I actually, in the title, when you said haha, I thought you were gonna design a real haha, like a landscape haha, and I'm like, where you can sort of see continuity without having physical continuity, or like an English garden kind of move, or other, not to say that that's what you would design here, but literally like what are some sectional ideas, planimetric ideas that would begin to connect communities physically, would begin to erase boundaries, smooth edges, allow for, you talked about multiple grounds, like what are those? So, bridges and ramps, I think, seem to be like connection devices, but often they're kind of dividers, because ramps, as soon as you have a ramp, you have a cross section through a ramp is a discontinuous kind of surface laterally. It's continuous in one direction, but discontinuous in another. And I think those very kind of careful analyses of different means and methods of connectivity versus division in the built realm would be interesting almost to develop as a taxonomy. I love the kind of Burle Marx drawings, and I think one could go in and sort of taxonomize all of the different elements that you're starting to deploy in these wonderful collage images, and almost make it a little bit more of an analytical kind of look at how one could design to the best that we can as architects and landscape designers, design the ground, as it were, the kind of conditions for the best, hopefully the best possible kind of future scenarios, and then let the kind of culture and the politics and the economics of the situation hopefully kind of flood the site in a positive way.
I mean, I like to say that a little bit on point with what Frank is talking about, this divisive elements that could potentially be divisive, these sort of rampings or bridges. I'm curious on why you chose an island, because in a way, the island is already creating a certain barrier between other spaces. And I don't know about anyone here who's like on the panel, but when I've gone to Randall's Island, I have to say that it was very difficult for me to see, let's say, a diversity in socioeconomic aspects of anybody going there. It's pretty much middle class people who are there, or do you see what I mean? So that is somehow not inviting to the whole of the population of the city. So I wondered why you made that decision to have this as the primary site, to make that inclusive environment, which I would argue could potentially not be actually. You're kind of creating a certain separation. But before, I mean, that's kind of one of the main things that sticks out to me. But I would have to say that the digital aspect of this, of having feeds from all over the world, if I understood that correctly in one of the parts of your program, is pretty amazing given what we're living through now, right? We're in a public space. This is our new reality of a public space. So it would almost have been more interesting to have had this project happen at the beginning of the pandemic, to really bring into focus, what does that mean, right? Because now that's a new reality. We have like this virtual public space versus this more formalized public space. And then, so that's kind of something to think about, I think, in the future, and how you would revise or perhaps inject this new proposal into that. But the main thing for me is really this division, right? You have this island. And so the inclusive aspect of it, how do you resolve that? Or why had you selected that as your main site?
As to answer that, so the reason why I chose the island would be because of the reading that we made that was written by Stuart Munro, and how he was treating the island as a way that it was like an experimentation. And I think Sabrina and I see this project is more of like an experimentation to today's society. So that's like one of the main aspects why we wanted a site to be an island.
And yeah.
Maybe you can continue, Sabrina.
Yeah, I was gonna just add to your point that during the semester, as we looked at these different avant-garde movements, xenofeminism was one that was very interesting to us, and they were pointing out how alienation, it's a form of like alienation in its productive connotation, like having a rooms of one's own. It could be a way to create more freedom. So for us, the idea of the island being in a way alienated from the mainland, but also connected through the transportation system was interesting, because it could support to the idea of allowing more individuality for the nature of the salon, which is really creating that inclusivity.
And
That's it.
Sorry, just like why specifically Randall's Island would be because of the social transformation that it has been through. But also, like, if you go to like 31 Sabrina, it's just like how the idea that it is close to like an airport and is connected by the 3 different boroughs, but also located in New York, which is like one of the most diverse cities. And that's like one of the main aspects why it is like Randall's Island.
If I could pick up on Anna's point about the island, I think, Anna, when you initially began to go, the project definitely took me in that direction, because this desire to create conditions of freedom, right, and also projecting out 100 years from now, I think it's really difficult to do that without also grappling with like systems of control, right, and the framework of control, and what does that mean? And I think specifically, even though the island of itself is being looked at as a site for experimentation, I think because Randall's Island's history, right, as an asylum and how it was transformed, and its proximity to Rikers Island, I think, that zone could have really, my wish would have been that actually this project was an extension on further transformation of Randall's Island, and also a complete transformation of Rikers Island as this kind of like free zone. But to the point about control, as you were describing the desire to have events organize social constructs, I think about, and even the typologies that you looked at, whether it was the salons, the marches, right? There's always some gatekeeper, right? That's either establishing like who can get in, who can be part of the club to share these ideas, or what are the forces of control that are enabling or allowing or tolerating even, right, certain acts that are happening, whether it's like these marches and kind of the statements that they create. And I wish that you folks would have looked at designing, and also I really love the, what's the game, sorry, the surrealist game that you described. Right? I forget exactly what it was called, but mapping that onto these systems of control. Like what do the kind of police forces, the legislative forces, the social forces, with the hierarchy of gender normative kind of conditions, like how do you begin to play a surrealist game with these things so that you can begin to rethink from a tectonic architectural standpoint, how you construct and assemble and design a space that begins to invert or play with these notions of freedom, because I think it's totally enabled and it exists on a scaffold of the constructs of control. I think also what I find interesting is the time scale that you're looking at, like a leap of 100 years, and how in some ways it seems like it's where the project lands. It feels, the feeling that it has for me is like it's more, I don't know, 200 or 300 years out than it is 100 years out, right? Not to be overly personal, but if you think about the context of like, even I myself as a human being live in New York City, I own a home in a neighborhood right now where I'm sitting, where 35 years ago, it was legal to discriminate against me to purchase a home here. 100 years ago, right, in 1920, my family construct was illegal and couldn't exist, right? So if you were to take someone from 100 years ago and kind of drop them here, like now, right, the physical conditions that they may see may look very kind of similar, like somewhat advanced. Of course, technological changes would really kind of advance that, but the social, the forms of control, right, radically changed. So, sorry, I'm getting a little bit.
Yeah.
So in thinking about these utilizing events to organize social constructs and projecting out this kind of future state, I wonder if it actually wouldn't look all that different, right? Or maybe, it's not to say I'm a little, I don't want to come across as trying to kind of tamp down the ambition of the projects, but I'm really arguing for like more of a more intensive investigation of like more specific conditions, picking up also on what Frank was speaking about, where, you know, thinking about Bentham and the panopticon, right? And like the way that these kind of formal systems begin to shape certain social constructs. And how do you play a surrealist game with these kinds of notions and other precedents to begin to develop the language that you then use to begin to design your landscape of freedom, right? And begin to tie that to the history of transformation, both through Randall's Island and maybe, at least my wish would be to also begin to co-opt the current state even of Rikers Island and begin to create your kind of free zone across these landscapes.
There's a really interesting, to follow up on that, Michael, there's an interesting question for me about calibration in landscape and the way that a person or people move through a landscape. I was remembering years ago when I was in grad school, I was lucky to have Alex Wall and Stefano De Martino for both a studio and a seminar one semester. And we did talk about Burl Marx. And if I remember correctly, I think I do, Alex and Stefano were making an argument that some of the thinking about pacing, rhythm, and calibration at the urban scale, the garden scale, the waterfront scale that Burl Marx dealt with was very precisely linked to the rhythms of life in the city as it flowed across those and punctuated them. And that had to do with how far you could walk in 5 minutes and 10 minutes, how fast people were driving next to the street, next to the beach, or next to the sidewalk, or coming into the city. And even to the level where some of those thoughts about calibration cascaded out on an infrastructural scale in one OMA project from back then. I think it was the Melunson art proposal. And so, you know, if you look at that proposal, you see that they're thinking not on the scale of too much foot traffic, but on the scale of infrastructure and vehicular traffic across a part of a region. And I remember our conversations back then having to do with how one could accurately make those calibrations. Also, that would have been a moment when I was deeply immersed, I remember, in Wim Wenders' films. And Alex and Stefano, again, had us read some interviews between Koolhof and Wim Wenders, talking about urban planning, urban design. And there were some notable points in some of those interviews, and another essay that I think Wenders gave as a lecture, where Wenders talks about the sort of radical cross-temporality of certain cities. And of course, if you look at Wings of Desire, you see that Wenders is exploring both the Cold War division of Berlin, but also the continuing echoes of the war in the city, the void spaces, and is clearly really interested in how liminal conditions emerge in the void spaces, or emerged in the void spaces in Berlin, and the beautiful sequences around Potsdamer Platz and in the library and outside the library. Anyway, the point that I would make here is, I wonder if there's a way that you can make a kind of a linkage between those forms of calibration, which we're familiar with as urbanists, as landscape designers, and the calibration of alienation that you're working towards in the project. Because you make an argument about spectacle, and to some degree, spectacle remains visuality in the project, although the haha is a big clue that on a number of different levels, and picking up on what Frank was saying, you know, it is a specific landscape technique that is then being atomized and deployed across your project in a number of different ways. And so again, like you're taking a calibration in landscape design, which I assume you've very intentionally leveraged, but you're repurposing it in ways which aren't about a body walking across a landscape. So spectacle is no longer pure visuality. And your argument about the salon enclosed and private, and the salon as totally radically inclusive in public space, and the kind of openness of your drawing, which is partly a familiar landscape architectural representation and partly sensation. And see, I think that that's where there's a really interesting structures of feeling in the way that Raymond Williams tried to articulate structures of feeling as a landscape, an economy, a cultural, like tectonic plate, which all of the people who participate in a structure of feeling would be completely aware of because they would be part of it. It's like, okay, well, that particular kind of jeans is what we're all wearing right now. We've all seen that music video. We're all listening to that music. We all make only this much money a year. These are the factories or the jobs that we work in. This is the food that we make because of our income. That forms a structure of feeling, you know? And in that sense, I think that the calibration, decalibration that you're working towards, spectacle is visuality, spectacle is something beyond visuality, sensation, affect, could totally take advantage of Raymond Williams' structures of feeling concept. And again, try to like drive that through the xenofeminist project because there's an exploration of universality in there and it is related to inclusivity. And I think that they are acutely alert to the problematic of radical inclusivity and radical universality, which is precisely why they're arguing, you know, let multiple sexes bloom. It's precisely why they underscore previous historical problematizations of universality to say, here, look, we're aware of all of these already rehearsed dead ends towards a ontology, a philosophy of universality. And so I think that the question of sensation and affect is something which could be calibrated. Now it depends then on your own proclivity. Like, do you want to calibrate it based on something like a scientific evaluation of the human body? Here's how far we can walk in 5 minutes. Here's the range of colors we can see. Here's how much we can process in terms of sensation, our 5 senses or more than 5 senses. Or do you want to do it in some different way? And to me, that's where your calibration, I think, could offer another model or a range of models. Like if you look at the human body as a limit, and then you show how historically we've already mapped out many different like extensions of those limits or erasures of those limits or reframings of those limits, and then drive your sensation affect universalism through that, that could be very interesting. Again, you could take a completely different philosophical take on this and say, yeah, but those scientific approaches to the body are provisional and incomplete. And so there's no way we'd want to ground a project based on the scientific knowledge of the limits of the senses, because we know that those are incomplete. But nonetheless, you know, I'm just thinking of, again, the work of a science fiction writer I admire tremendously, Peter Watts, who also is a trained marine biologist and builds a lot of his story structures around the science of living creatures that he knows really, really well. Of course, he undermines what you usually would expect would be the outcome of encounters between humans and non-humans by extending that science, the limits of those sciences that he knows. But he's like deeply rooted in the science of what the limit of the human body is. So there's things that our eyes do and our brain can process that almost all of us share universally. Like you can trick a human brain and a human pair of eyes pretty easily. And so Peter builds an entire human to non-human relationship construct around that. And you know, it's important because I think the alienation idea that the xenofeminists are working on is not just the alienation of an individual subject to the world, which is something we are alien to, but it is to the radically non-human. And so, you know, there's just a really beautiful set of themes that you've taken up in the project. But again, I would say for me, a really key question in your project is, would you accept a kind of a provisionally scientific definition of the limits of human perception and sensation? And then by cataloging those, then find the trigger points that you could push beyond them to then understand where universality can be established? Or would you not, you know, would you not be interested in that at all? It's an open question. You don't have to answer it right now, but that, to me, that's one of the most interesting questions in your project.
I think it's one that this is a very accomplished project, and it has a lot of provocations in it. And I agree with Ed's point about calibration, you know, kind of it coming down to calibration. But the perceptual apparatus is the only thing that I find troubling here. One, because that there seems to be kind of two different registers of the perceptual apparatus. One is textural and the other is figural, and both are operating simultaneously, and both with a fairly consistent humanist, almost universalist register, right? And I would say that is the only place where I would really kind of take that step back and try to calibrate a bit more. Certainly there is an understanding of the interlockedness between spatial politics and sexual politics, right? You know, and that discourse is one where sexual politics and spatial politics, the inside out, the, you know, heterogeneous, you know, heterosexual, sexual normative, gender normative worlds occupy one type of space, and then the other occupies others. And but the understanding of 100 sexes, to be really clear, actually comes from Liz Gross's description of DeLooz, which she called 1,000 sexes. So actually it's like exponentially 10 down from Liz Gross's formulation. But not only hers, not only was it 1,000 sexes, but it's 1,000 tiny sexes, right? And the 1,000 tiny sexes is really just, for Liz Gross, reading through DeLooz, supposed to be a kind of tip of the iceberg for the multiplicity that could exist if we erase any kind of sense of a normative identity. If we, you know, if we get to that point where there's no more normative identity, then it could be 1,000 tiny, it could be 1,000,000 tiny, it could be however many. So the bloom in that sense is like a kind of super bloom, right? You know, it's like, right, a flood of differentiation, of course, right? Differentiation as the rule rather than the exception. Getting back to that, so then the question of the island, then I actually think that the island is kind of your straw man. The you're going to territorialize before you re-territorialize. You're going to bound this thing to have a kind of private or an inside or, you know, an exceptional thing, and then, you know, and then it's going to proliferate. And I think, you know, yeah, I mean, because right now we're neither in yet the 1,000 tiny sexes, nor are we exactly at a normative heterosexuality, thank goodness. So we're kind of in this mid zone, and so you create this fictional private, right? This kind of fiction of a private world that then proliferates, right? That then spreads in the same way that, you know, Perez is Burning went from the club to the movie to the public, you know, spheres. But given that, I think you could be a bit more adventurous, say, with the layers and relationships of each of the kind of visual effects of that space making. For example, when you look at the plan drawings of these Burle Marx gardens, right? There's still really thick black outlines of the figures. There's still very clean perceptual apparatus of like this kind of texture map and that kind of texture map. When you're in the plane of the space and you're using the perceptual apparatus that is there, there's still very much a ground, and then there's a kind of profile of the scene, and you know, there's a lot of lasting permutations of the perceptual apparatus of that universal person rather than the 1,000 tiny sexes, right? So I think it could get more contemporary. See here, see, I mean, I can still kind of tell what's what. What's a screen? What's a roof? What's a balustrade? What's a handrail? What's a, you know, I mean, it's all still a little bit, right? You know, and I think what you could do is I think you could get a little bit more, kind of become a little more digital, maybe become a little bit more cyborg about it, become a little less humanist, and break down some of those perceptual apparatus, because you're no longer necessarily bound to them. But again, that's a calibration thing, right? You know, overall, it you know, I'm seeing a lot of discussions about like, oh, you know, how are we going to maybe kind of revamp the queer aesthetic arguments that happened at the beginning or the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st. And I see a lot of discussions about how to deal with landscape and, you know, and non-landscape. And I see a lot of discussions about, you know, what is the new public? What's the new private? You're looking inside my home right now, you know, or you could be looking at my Zoom background, but you are still, you know, having a kind of private moment. And this is dealing with bunch of that stuff at once, and it's done with a rigor and a thoughtfulness that is very, very nice, and graphically, you know, hearts in my emoji eyes.
One thing I have to say about the landscape and how the project fits on site. Somehow I'm reminded of Georg Simmel, who talks about nature and landscape, and he says that nature doesn't exist the moment that you cut it into segments. So basically what we see is parts of landscape. And I kind of see that in your project, I see like through the collages, I see these different landscapes that you have created, and in relation to the openness of the space and these connection points that you're mentioning. I don't know if this project is like for this specific site, or it could be maybe somewhere nearby, which there is another empty space, or it could be perhaps being there and then added somewhere else. I think this sensibility of the many layers and the many, let's say, many worlds you're adding up, it's what I find very interesting in this project, and how that can evolve. It's like a non-stop condition.
Just a quick comment. Sorry, I have to leave soon, but I find the project amazing. It's kind of ironic that you're using 1920s graphics to depict, you know, 100 years into the future, and somehow it kind of works. Maybe because we feel like it's a little more believable now. The one thing I want to just, for myself, maybe I'm speaking to myself, I want to caution architects becoming scientists and social engineers, is that I think we're not very good engineers, and we're not very good scientists. We're actually, I mean, I'm interested in pseudoscience because it kind of expands our imagination, but I'm not interested in approximating science. I do think that there are shortcomings of social engineering and the new urbanists and things like that. But in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is liberate you, trying to, in my own way, to say that there are certain things that are within your skill set and within your facility that you could set up to calibrate and perhaps allow for appropriation, but you don't have to reach the level of specificity to figure out every single moment. I think the intuition, the instinct to create multi-layers, to create complexity, to create opportunism, and in moments of where different sectors of people and different types of people can kind of appropriate and feel at home in this landscape, are all good intuitions. And I would focus more on actually try to imagine this today rather than 100 years. I think there's something maybe too easy about saying, well, it's in the future, so we can only speculate. but how would you transform Central Park? How would you transform Prospect Park? What does it mean to have those places that are, in a way, the most diverse places we have in the city? Because when I'm in Prospect Park, and if I'm riding my bike, on my left is a lawyer and on my right is a bus driver, and there's no distinction. And it's something about that neutral field really, really works. So I guess I would encourage to be a little bit more daring and throw this in today's context, and not to necessarily have to figure every single thing out and engineer it all, but to actually throw it in the context and kind of take a risk of what could the new landscape be, and where would you put it? Would you put it on an island, or would you put it on the Upper East Side, and really mix that up? You know, did we engineer the High Line? Did we anticipate? I mean, it was an idea of saving the High Line. Nobody could have expected the social economic outcome of the High Line. Maybe there was some speculation, but certainly, you know, if developers were onto that, they would have bought the High Line themselves. But that's not where the seed of it was. So I guess I'm saying, there's a lot of things we can do as architects and designers to set up a system, but we don't necessarily have to figure it all out in design.
Well, thanks for that closing comment, Yama. And thank you to all the critics here for an amazing discussion, and for the adventuresomeness of the students to take this on. You know, there was a point at which they were doing normative drawings, and Evan said, you know what, let's not do these drawings. And this is when the project made the leap into an experimental territory that is quite a juggling act. And I will say it's been amazing to see this come into this level of resolution.
Can I add something quickly to that? And it's sort of just to sort of tickle some of the comments earlier on about affect and intricacy. The experiments in this project went as so far as to take apart masks and covered with glitter, and to say, well, what kind of architecture can we imagine from taking apart a mask and dumping it in plaster? And it just was delightful to see that level of sort of uninhibited playfulness in how to approach the concepts that have ended up coming together in this project.
Yeah, I second that. I mean, there was a moment where I thought this was going to be a costume design project, which actually could have been totally appropriate. And so someone mentioned there was a discussion, remark about it being humanist. I would say that you guys are, you know, the range within which you intellectually and creatively operated this year is pretty remarkable. The fact that you had to actually make a project is kind of, in a way, bad and limiting, you know, in a funny sense of our kind of pedagogical environment. I think you guys have a kind of seeding territory that can produce lots more, and hopefully you'll continue with that. So it was a pleasure.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure to be here.
With you, yeah. It was a great year.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think is next. Yeah, Tulay and Ostap, you guys are next.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce briefly what we do in our section, and Ostap is going to introduce our students. We teach a section of the degree project curriculum called, our section is titled Architecture and the Atmosphere. And we approach the atmosphere from two poles. On one hand, like one text that's really important to us is Luce Irigaray's text on air, and how she argues that, like, how she makes the point that air, atmosphere, is never owned by anyone, but is always shared. And with that comes our interest in the collective, basically, the collective socius. And on the other hand, we're very much also invested in environmental and mechanical systems that make up architecture, kind of as the underlying, let's say, the system of architecture that makes it somehow in relation to, or makes it atmospheric, or places it in relation to atmosphere. However, students choose to define it. And in between these two poles, what we are fundamentally invested in is the disciplinarity of architecture, the discipline. So how can we go into our discipline, the discipline of architecture, and from then on ask questions that are, let's say, socially and culturally relevant to today. So yes, that's us.
So Iris and Mia, our two students, started by studying snow, insulation, gradients of interiority, isolation, and privacy. And throughout last semester and this semester, they kept returning to two precedents, Toyo Ito's White U House and Nishizawa's Moriyama House, as a way for understanding interiority, exteriority, privacy, and as a way of testing their formal operations. So it resulted in a disciplinary project, which you'll see today, that one could say domesticates the corridor.
All right, just one more thing. We're also joined Timothy Simonds is our HMS professor, who's also been working with our students closely. Yeah, Iris, Mia.
Mia, did you unmute yourself yet?
Hi, I'm Mia.
Hi, I'm Iris. Our project is If Eaves Dropped, Rethinking Privacy Now. The conventional understanding of ownership usually comes from buying or possessing property, but we're redefining ownership architecturally in relationship to enclosure. In any building, one claims ownership of a space by enclosing a space. Traditionally, one encloses a space through the control of accessibility, for example, opening or closing a door, lighting condition, switching on and off lights, and visibility. Hence, any interior space can be labeled as private when someone demonstrates his or her ability in controlling the enclosure. However, when individuals lose their ownership over a space, what cannot be removed is one's privacy. Our project imagines a new sense of privacy, transient privacy. In other words, privacy without ownership. It is established through curvilinear spaces and columns that allow connection and separation. However, they only allude to enclosure, but never offer a complete one in the building. Our current understanding of privacy can be traced back to the ancient Greek times. As shown on the plan here, Greeks are the first one who established a clear distinction between a public courtyard and private rooms. As Robin Evans points out in his essay, Figures, Doors, and Passages, after the Renaissance, corridor plan emerged and became widely adopted. The clear separation between room and corridor represents an explicit division between served and servant spaces. And since then, such thinking has been drilled into our mind. Privacy is guaranteed when we can enclose a space.
Times have changed. Compared to the past centuries, we are living in a more ephemeral way due to the development of technology.
Transient privacy is a product of digital age. The digital age is a technological term that happened around 1970s. It has profoundly affected the way we think about and discuss privacy, but has not been manifested architecturally. 50 years later, we're still talking about the duality of the online-offline world, but have not matured our formal ways of understanding it. Here's a quote from To Ito, where he wrote in 1997, where he discussed the new but strange sensation of being connected yet separated.
And this president is powered by To Ito. He's proposing a new type of housing for Tokyo girls and imagining a new nomadic lifestyle for them who spend their daily life in boutique shops, restaurants, or coffee shop every day. So the architectural form is a retractable hut with only 3 pieces of furniture inside, including essential needs. And all the poles dispersed in the city are all interconnected by signal and information.
The internet has revolutionized our way of thinking about boundaries in relation to privacy. One became increasingly comfortable in extending oneself through sharing information with strangers online. That is to say, one's boundary could change tremendously and swiftly in the virtual world. However, such acceptance of a much more negotiable boundary has now reflected architecturally in the physical world. For us to rethink privacy in the new context of digital age, we must break ourselves from the binary organization of room and corridor and formally express how transient privacy affects the way we live.
And we start our formal investigation with transforming the precedents. So for the White Hill House, we're adding more curvilinear walls to create more corridors in different intersections, as well as in occupiable courtyards. And for the Moliyama House, we're turning the traditional architectural enclosure into a continuous wall, which blurs the interior and exterior. And for this one, we are exploding all the walls into columns. So the various density of columns and incomplete walls will challenge the traditional furniture layout, and the furniture pieces becomes a division between spaces as well.
This is an early study of the dropped eaves. Dropped eaves serve as a visual barrier and provide some degrees of privacy for each occupant. And also the split in the roof can suggest there are two occupants living in the same curvilinear spaces. On the right, you can see two opposing arcs where we were exploring the opportunities of possible intersections of the two arcs coming together. This is also an early study of the topologically connected spaces. So on the models of the photos of the models here, you can see, even though it's seemingly separated on the ground floor, it's all connected on the top floor. These are our early hybridization iterations where we're trying to combine connectors, situators, and topologically connected all three ideas together. For our choice of site, we chose Tokyo, Japan. Japan is currently experiencing an unprecedented rate of aging population. In Tokyo, a majority of senior citizens are living in the suburbs, which are outside the core of Tokyo. Due to the extreme isolation provided by individual houses, a phenomenon called lonely death has emerged. As you can see on the screen here, according to United Nations statistics, by 2050, the ratio of working age to retire age is going down to 1.7. And it's projected that by 2100, every Japanese worker will essentially gain a statistical grandparent on top of their own family that they have to support. So that's why we're proposing a co-housing prototype that brings these two populations together. In terms of the site, we chose Omori, which is at the transition zone between the urban and suburban of Tokyo City. Even though it's relatively distant from the city center, it's well connected by the public transportation system.
So the site has a relatively steep topography and acts as a connection between the main commercial street and the smaller residential streets at the top of the hill. Considering the quality of arcs, we are proposing two large-scale arcs that are as a gesture in connecting the three endpoints on the site. So the two big opposed arcs allow for a relatively large influx of people coming out from the train station to take the shortcut up to the hill. Smaller scale arcs rest alongside the big arcs are for the residents.
So first of all, let's take a look at the project from a public's perspective. So here on the right-hand side, you can see the Omori train station that we were mentioning before. So there's gonna be a large influx of people exiting from the train station. After they cross the street, they get onto our public path of the project. And on the bottom here, you can see there's a branching out of the path, which is leading to the community courtyard. Here's a view looking at the courtyard. This is actually the only space along the public path where the public can have a physical interaction with the residents living in the building. Or they can keep making their way up. And this is a view looking at this part of the path, which is underneath the building. And finally, they're eventually making their way onto the top of the hill. This view is taken at the end of the path, looking back at the project. Now let's take a look at the project from a resident's perspective.
So this architectural form addresses both continuity of spaces and the separation between activities. Curved space act as connectors, inducing movement, while column act as situators, allowing for habitation. The connectors intersect with each other tangentially. the intersection of which allows circulation to flow from one connector to the next seamlessly. So on this plan, you can see segments of curvilinear spaces utilized as individual bedrooms are all connected without doors or any form of walled enclosure. And in this section, you can see one single room can be entered from the tip of the big arc, and there are a group of rooms inside the smaller arc behind the big arc. Residing in this type of housing, people's visual experience is interrupted by the curvilinear geometries, such as walls and dropped eaves. For the geometry of privacy, the more isolated connector is narrower, you can see to the left, the more isolated connector is narrower with large radius, and the intersection is distant from the inhabitant, versus in the more connected room to the right, spaces is wider and with smaller radius, and the geometry is easily intersected with other massing. For the columns, besides acting structurally, more importantly, the columns perform architecturally. So conventional bedroom furniture pieces are organized in relation to the situators, which weakly suggesting zones of privacy. So for the operation, we are dividing each arc into zones, and only 3 columns are placed to situate one piece of furniture.
Okay, before we finish our presentation, please join us now for a virtual tour around the building. When a resident lives in this house, she enters from a door that's located at the tip of an arc. She walks along the curved wall for a few seconds and finds her own furniture nesting in between a few columns. She looks up as she walks towards her bed. Sunlight beams through an aperture where a few roof surfaces come to an end. Then she looks down at the stair leading to somewhere, but the destination seems to be hidden behind the curved trajectory. She hears some light footsteps as she finally leans against the backboard of her bed. She moves around on her bed for a better view, but the curved wall and slanted roof prevent her inquiring gaze from entering the space. She begins to wonder if anyone else is here. Soon, a sudden laughter echoes in the space. Someone's in my room, she thinks to herself, or am I in someone else's room?
Instead of defining a clear boundary of one's territory, the sense of ownership in this project is built upon one's accumulating experience and sharpening sensibility of scale and location. The interior experience is mostly homogeneous. It's hard to determine any exact location of oneself in relation to which part of the arc one is occupying at the moment. Such a sense of spatial ambiguity creates a delay of acknowledging one's own living condition. In our project, for all the residents, isolation is always a state of relation and could be intruded at any given moment by others. Perhaps there is no stage of being alone, but a transient sense of being separated together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you, there's an elegance to the project that I wanted to applaud in terms of both the argument itself and the representation of the architectural proposal. But maybe just, could I ask you sort of at the end of your presentation, if you could somehow tie it back to the thesis? I mean, one of the comments I would make just about the presentation style itself is that there seemed to be a hard line in the way you delivered the presentation between kind of research and proposal. And sometimes the best arguments are the ones where you can't tell the difference between the kind of building up of the conceptual argument with the kind of answer to that argument. You know, so they I think oftentimes those two things want to blend into one another and become each other, sort of, you know, in a much more knitted fashion. But here there was like, okay, I've done all of my research and now I'm going to design a building, and that's kind of what it felt like. And I just wonder, in order to maybe counteract that a little bit, could you then somehow tie this? What is it? What was Robin Evans's argument? You know, about the corridor, or how does this prove out his argument? How does this refute his argument? Does it extend the argument? I mean, what's the relationship back to the body of research that you did initially to kind of kick off the project before you started taking us into the site research and so on? I mean, is there a sort of culmination of thinking that this now sort of delivers for you in terms of the conceptual argument that you started with?
I think if we were to keep drawing the line that Robin Evans drew, I would say he was so for like the 15th century before the Renaissance, there was the matrix of interconnected rooms, and then because that's because at that time the society really favors the physicality of bodies and also the gregariousness. However, that moved on to the next chapter, which is after the Renaissance, and the corridor plan became adopted because people were thinking there's like the concern of hygiene and all other kinds of factors. So, and ever since, the corridor plan was widely adopted, and we still, I'm pretty sure we're still in this kind of corridor plan everywhere kind of situation. So I think we are adding a next chapter to Robin Evans' essay, but we don't want to categorize or classify this as like all rooms or all corridors, because we do think this is a new space, and this is the next chapter in Robin Evans' essay, if that answers your question.
And what social realities or outcomes does this new space, do you think, produce, or will it produce? I mean, he was always keen to sort of tie what he read in social behavior and how that almost in a kind of stealth way sort of manifests itself in the architectural things that were taken for granted, like corridors and doors and passages and windows and so forth. Mm-hmm. So what is the new social reality that either this project maps or it potentially prefigures to come? I mean, what is your statement here?
I think for us, I don't think there's like a how do I say it? Like a clear answer to that, because we are living in this very complex context, because like even during the semester, we switched from like physical world into like a digital realm of production and like pushing this project further. So I think like even for us, there's a change in like switching from physical to virtual. So we also have some mixed feelings about this, because before I think our attitude towards the digital age and like technology, we were critiquing it for sure. But right now, like when all of us, we're kind of living our thesis right here, because all of us are isolated in our own room, and this will not happen if we don't have technology, if we don't have the platform Zoom. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that question, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think it's much more complex than that.
Actually, I want to pick up on your response to that question, because I think it suggests that there's a certain isolation that we may feel like in this context. But I would argue that, I mean, at least I feel this way. I am more self-conscious, like because I can see my own video and everyone else's video, than I would be if we were all in a room kind of facing you guys in a crit context, right? So somehow the virtual layer kind of increases my own kind of sense of self-awareness, like in this context. Of course, I can change settings to like mitigate that, but I think it's important to kind of like be critical of like some of those assumptions about like what may create kind of privacy or like isolation. You know, to be candid, well, I think it's a beautiful project. But to be candid though, the sense that I got looking at some of the images was just like a deep sense of anxiety, because it's interesting also paired with the previous project that we discussed, where I kind of brought up Jeremy Bentham and the panopticon, because there's always the possibility, right, that someone could walk in within the kind of arc of my sensory experience, right? I'm kind of always on a heightened alert. And how can I ever kind of really be at rest or comfortable within any of the kind of programmatic zones within the house? And also that by intention, right, you don't distinguish any of the zones. You want it to be kind of fluid and continuous and like indistinguishable, with the exception of the situators, as you call them, the columns that begin to frame furniture that suggests specific activities. And, you know, I feel like a narrative took hold and it kind of became a little bit of a runaway train for you guys. Because if I'm not mistaken, where you started was speaking about aging populations and like people having to care for their parents or grandparents, right, within the same space. And I wonder if, it's not to say that maybe formally or geometrically the project needs to change all that much, but I wonder if there was a rereading of some of the surface, just even like the conditions of surface and transparency, where you want to introduce that strategically, right? Where you want to have, or maybe how these kind of cadence, the way you think about the cadence of transparency along these arcs begin to provide some kind of wayfinding kind of clue, right? Maybe, you know, you can still kind of be on the side of the spectrum where you want the experience to be very fluid and ambiguous, but how do you begin to layer in like through materiality, and how you begin to connect certain programming experiences happening right across these bands to begin to kind of address anybody that the kind of programmatic impetus for what you are pursuing, right? That said, I think it's a really provocative investigation and pushing of kind of corridor as experience. And I think just kind of having that feedback loop where you begin to think about the programmatic pressures that can be applied kind of based on the premise, I think can continue to advance the project even further. Wonderful work.
You know, I guess one of the questions that comes up here for me is the degree to which in the next years, I'm just going to ignore the pandemic situation because that's a big kettle of fish, but let's assume we go back to normal life in a few years. The degree to which the micro infiltration of technology will change the way that care is delivered, both to older folks and younger folks, and to each other, and that we deliver to each other, assuming, you know, we have a few people who are perfectly, quote, able-bodied living in the same space. I appreciated that you footnoted Rakitansky's Adult Day project because, well, because I know Mark and I know what an incredibly empathic and alert thinker and designer he is, but also because that project was important for me years ago when I first saw it published, long before my parents became ill and died. And I actually haven't revisited Mark's project since quite a few years, so I think it would probably mean something very different to me now, as those projects inevitably do once one has lived through those situations. I also thought of Madeline Gins and Arakawa's work and how relentless in the most optimistic way they were about context disarrangement as one of the fundamental things that architecture could give. Disarray of context, destabilization of perception, they argued would lead us to overcome death. And I remember back in probably the late 90s, them still speaking at conferences in New York. You know, conferences with people like Rem and all the usual suspects, really the highest level at Columbia and other universities and venues, and them making their pitches for architecture against death. And the sort of nonplussed expressions that came from the community around them, largely like, to some extent, like you can't really be serious, right? You're speaking allegorically or metaphorically. And Madeline and Erica are always just saying, no, we're not bullshitting. This is architecture against death. And I think that they lost a chunk of their audience because they were so committed to that project. And I see echoes of their tactics in your project, but it's not connected at all to the eavesdropping public-private space at all, in my mind. It's more connected to the question of context disarrangement and looking at ways of living in overlapped space, ways of intergenerational living, ways of imagining smooth space with very little division. Although I return to Erica and Gins again, because there's a whole series of furniture placement and corridor dimension decisions that you make in your project, which are difficult. And obviously deliberately so. Your radius studies and so forth, like we spoke about calibration in the previous project, it seems to me that you've calibrated very carefully. And that's an interesting series of moves. And so I question to some degree the appropriateness of that in the context of intergenerational day-to-day life and care. It would be interesting to look for ways. Mark Rakitansky's project is very gentle in the way that it functions as a series of memory triggers for the inhabitants. It's forming an intimate, small in scale communal space where memory triggers are deployed to reassure and orient. It could be that your project would do that. My initial response was to think, no, this wouldn't work. Acoustically, this would be really hard. In terms of people who have to use wheelchairs, it would be impossible to navigate, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you could respond by saying, okay, yeah, well, this is the first draft, and we're gonna change it so that we can handle people with different abilities in terms of walking and so forth. We can modulate the acoustics in certain ways using baffles and materials and sound control and stuff like that. That's cool. But to me, the more important aspect of the project is the degree to which you recognize the cognitive and physiological spectrum of all the people who'll be living there. Because again, you did state pretty clearly, this is about, the lonely death question, at least a substantial part of it. And so then, I immediately think, okay, well, as the architect, technically, what are the ways that you're calibrating your design moves to respond to all of the challenges that those present? And I was thinking about the ways that, again, people live in overlapped space already. And, in many different cultures, across many different economic spectra, the kinds of spaces that you're suggesting are already an incredible luxury. It's only from the perspective that I might have in this room with all of you that we would say, well, maybe we could do something that would work a little bit better for an aging population that can't walk, might need to be wearing diapers and be taken care of like they were a 6-month-old infant most of the time, which is the way my mom lived the last few years of her life in a care facility. And so that becomes a very, very interesting question for me in your project. And maybe a zoom into the level of detail that you see in Rakitansky's project would be appropriate in your project, so that, again, I used the term earlier today, the kind of post-project project. Maybe your post-project project would be an assessment of how, if you kept most or all of your proposal as it exists right now, you would retrofit it if you had to take care of your own children or your own grandparents or your own parents in that space, with the incredibly difficult and messy tasks that one is faced when one's taking care of someone who's in their 80s or 90s who can't walk. And I know I'm speaking extraordinarily pragmatically in this sense, and you've touched on other aspects that are a bit more whimsical, and we've speculated wildly all day, as we should in thesis. But I just feel it's important to bring this up. And the only other comment I'll make is, again, the question of public and private is one where historically, there were just, let a million publics and privates bloom. There were so many across cultures and across the centuries, different ideas of what was acceptable to be done in public and what should remain in private, that I think you would need an exhaustive taxonomy for us to understand how you feel those moments in history are being irrevocably changed. I often make references to science fiction because I love it. There's a very beautiful novel called The Destructives by de Abatua, and he maps out a near future where after a kind of computer catastrophe, a researcher has to go back into the history of a house to understand what happened in that house. And he does this wearing a full body sense stimulation suit and immersive virtual reality interface. And, the suit can make him feel like the temperature of the house when he's in the archive. And that entire part of the story revolves around the way that the mother of the house deals with a bully situation that her teenage daughter's experiencing, and the extremely advanced, to a military level, software tools she uses to try to protect her daughter. And again, it's a pretty thrilling first third of the book, to my mind, because it maps out exactly where we are right now in history, or maybe in another 5 to 7 years where we'll be. And because it takes on exactly some of the issues that are directly and indirectly invoked in your project around the questions of public and private. And so there's an instrumentality that sits, whether it's architecture or economy or cultural structures or technology, that sits in that space between public and private. And that, I feel, is what your project needs to take on. So anyway, the novel is called The Destructives, and it's by, is it Michael or Miguel Abatua or Matthew de Abatua? And it's a really, really sharp, super intelligent meditation on these questions of technologically inflected, shifting divisions between public and private. So take a look at that if you get a chance.
Hi, so my role in this review is to follow what Ed says and go, yeah. That's really amazing. Makes me realize how much I miss you, Ed. Yeah, the science fiction of this is it, I think, good architecture or architectural theses are always going to have a kind of science fictional, or should always have a sort of science fictional edge to them. And I see that here, right? So it's like, okay, so that we don't have doors or we don't have doors or passages, and then we do have a period of doors and passages, and then all we have is passages, right? And we get at this future where all we have is passages, which makes it really hard to kind of get into the project because it's kind of hermetic to just being these passages. But in this, it reminds me of the oeuvre of Bong Joon-ho, right? That whether that's Snowpiercer and everybody's on the train, or Parasite, where we have a kind of space where these people are living, and then a space where those people are living, and then there's a kind of tightness to everything that has to be navigated. And I really like this image here, actually, because of that table that sits awkward, or the bed that kind of has to be behind the column, and and those sorts of negotiations, those spatial negotiations that have to happen. But I wonder if maybe it isn't just a little bit too clean in terms of its volumetric extrusion from ground to top. Can you go to a sectional image of it? I think at the end you had a couple of sectional. Yeah, so see what I mean by it being kind of hermetic and closed, and you can see that in this. There's not a lot of articulation at the ground plane. It is sort of like the Snowpiercer train in that sense. Yeah, you kind of get this weird space underneath where you bonk your head or something, you know. And it's like the thing about the Bong Joon-ho that's interesting, or even, you know, the Upside Down, right, you know, and the in Stranger Things, right, is that there's this sense that there's a kind of the people who, or have you seen Tales from the Loop, right? That's another kind of interesting provocation of spaces that are real, whose reality is constructed by taking care of those within that reality. So like Tales from the Loop is a kind of good example of that. And Parasite, right, is also a really good example of that. And so caretaking in that sense means supporting that reality. And so there's all these kind of weird other spaces that occur in and around it that have like half spaces, or, you know, like in Parasite, their weird bathroom where the toilet is kind of sitting on that kind of weird plinth, and, you know, they're sort of underground, and, you know, it's a Dostoevsky, you know, kind of rehearsal for the 21st century. And I think that there's an opportunity to inflect your care space with those kinds of secondary, tertiary weirdnesses that will come from a world of all passages. You know, so like in Snowpiercer, they're literally people who are like living in the wall of the train, right? You know, and then they find those people, or there are literally people who are kind of like occupying those medium spaces in between. And I think that that will start to break out of this. It's a little bit of a kind of oppressive regime of space where it's just, you know, and then and closed on both ends, and, you know, right. And I think that you could be your own resistance within that. And so I would love to see a little bit more of that. But I appreciate this idea that this kind of constructed reality within this space that that starts to present some of its own kind of interesting provocations and problematics of the architectural scale.
Maybe I'll jump in here. It's interesting to think about this project through the lens of design research, and maybe I'll get really basic about it. I mean, in some ways, I think there's been an interesting discussion in the chat about how this project reads really differently, whether you put on a functionalist lens or whether you put on a sort of speculative lens, because then you can query the project in a whole different way. And I have to say, I like the root of the project in a kind of demographic analysis a lot. And that sort of opens up the door for me to look at this project in terms of actual problem solving. And it's so interesting to rub problems the wrong way to see what happens. Like, so Ed, you phrased the core of my critique really beautifully, which is that if you've ever spent any time caretaking an elderly person, this environment is incredibly traumatic. It just is. So what do you do with that? Do you say to yourself, this project reveals the limits of architecture to actually help in intergenerational cohabitation? Or that it actually forces those questions? Or that it's actually on the verge of some brilliant realizations that it needs to actually go further with? And again, the answers to that, I think, really differ between whether you put on the sort of speculative lens or you put on the sort of functionalist lens. And maybe there's even a hybrid of those. But, you know, for example, if you simply take this as an urban proposal, the bravura of the form on the urban landscape vis-a-vis the experience of the interior spaces, to me, does not make sense. It is as a provocation And so again, I think it's a really accomplished piece of architecture. I just don't think that it aligns with its own hypothesis, which is to say, let's overlap spaces for intergenerational cohabitation.
You guys want to say something? I'm just.
Well, it is dystopic. Yeah, talk a little bit about that. There is a dystopic aspect to it. You'll admit that, right?
Wait, sorry. This is a question for us, right? Because it broke up a little bit, so I didn't hear part of Alex's comment actually.
Oh, well, maybe I think the way Dora just put it to you is kind of one way to look at it, which is to say, is there a part of this that's dystopic for you? Like, do you want to challenge us? And if so, what is it you want to challenge? Because I'm missing that very simple idea, right? I love the concept that you're trying to design for cohabitation of generations. I love that idea. And again, I love the architecture. I think you're doing something super sophisticated. I don't think those two things align. There's a rub, and the rub is potentially super interesting. So that's what I want to hear more about.
I don't think I would use the word dystopic in this sense, but I feel like when we talk about caretaking, I mean, yeah, there's the physical constraints of how a wheelchair can occupy the space, or how someone with a stick can walk through the spaces. But I think there's also the psychological aspect of caretaking, because I think what's happening in Japan is actually they are physically isolated in houses, but they're also mentally isolated. Maybe they have families, but the families never visit them. And also they don't have friends or anyone that they can talk to. So maybe from our perspective, this anyone can intrude at any moment may sound very horrific, or like we have to be hyper aware all the time. But maybe like if we are thinking from a senior's perspective, maybe those accidents can become opportunities where they can have interactions with each other. I think there are opportunities.
I mean, I don't take issue so much with the private-public issues. I do like how there's a kind of intimacy and blending and separation and coming together. But I also think about what these bodies are like, these aging and sick bodies, and what they experience, and the space seems deliberately meant to provoke any ideas of comfort or a kind of humanist approach to design. That's what made me think of Peter Eisenman's, the split bed and the columns that sort of hover in front of you when you're eating dinner. That's meant to be uncomfortable and meant to be provocative and against functionalism, against kind of humanism. So you have that quality to your project, but I think some of us still don't quite understand why. And because I think it's separate from the private-public thing. Why that way of designing space for those bodies?
I think actually for us, the form itself is more related to our thesis. The site and the population actually come pretty late in the process of doing this thesis project. So maybe that's why it's looking like we didn't really consider the senior bodies that much.
I think also a question would be perhaps how many people can this space accommodate, because I'm thinking of privacy. I completely agree with the comments I mentioned before. I'm thinking of privacy, like privacy has to do more with like visual connections and distances, let's say. So I'm wondering if you have thought how many people can live there, or if you already mentioned and I missed it. And because this spareness is like a very luxurious idea, and of course you have privacy if you're like further away from the person, even if you have like after a point you don't see him anymore. So I'm wondering in that respect, what is your thought? Like, is it like a very, do you imagine this is a very luxurious place? Not in terms of materials, but in terms of, you know, like the more space you occupy, in a way, you could say that is more luxurious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are currently about like 25 to 27 people in this current iteration. Yeah, I think we did have a couple of conversations about this being pretty luxurious, like formal wise, and also like just from like a real estate point of view. But like, I think because we chose to deploy such curvilinear ways of defining and really exploring the opportunities between privacy and curvature. So that's why we just like went down that route and really tried to see like how can we achieve privacy without any enclosure, and how do we do that with this form.
So maybe I can jump in here. I have a few comments and critiques actually of the criticism itself. One is like, and I'll just say it straightforward, I don't find the word functionalism useful here, and I don't know what's meant by it. And I think maybe there's another way to, or another word as problematic as that, to use that can start or help us reflect on the project, and that I would say is some kind of realism. And it's not the realism necessarily of, you know, like finding not realism in the, let's say, in the Russian Stalinist sense, but it's a realism that you would find in, let's say, the spaces that they are creating. And I think they are somehow, Iris and Mia are committed at the end of the day. So when, let's say, the question of, is it really old bodies? Like, how will we care for? Well, I think it's really incredibly relevant and important, and this is a question that they should be hearing. I also think like the body that they are thinking of is not necessarily a body that needs care. It's not necessarily a young body, but it's a body that's in between. That's a lonely body. That's the problem that they are dealing with. So while there are like all these issues that come with that can be explored, and I think where criticism is right, they could potentially push the project further in determining, let's say, the sizes of the spaces, like the distances, like passages, like how passages happen. I think that's also like, that's one point, definitely a decision for you guys to make, whether you want to take it in that direction or not. But if I go back to this question of like, let's say a realism, a realism of the spaces that are being created, I think one thing that's not necessarily coming across so much in this conversation, and it goes to Daniela's question, which I really find is super important. Like, why is this provocation being made? Because it is provocative. You know, these spaces that people have responses to these spaces. Like some find it, let's say, oppressive, repressive. Some find it, some are driven by anxiety looking at it based on their experiences. Some people find it beautiful. And I think there are instances of all these. So it is provocative. The question is, why is this provocation being made? And I think you do need to have an answer for that. And I think at the end of the day, the big provocation, let's say, is against walls in architecture. Now, whether you find that provocative as the jury or not, I mean, that's something, you know, again, I think it's something up to you. But I personally find that very provocative. Like, can we imagine a way of making spaces without walls? I mean, okay, yes, there are the walls of curves, but like in terms of arranging the furniture, in terms of, let's say, separating the spaces or defining spaces, identifying spaces, like how and maybe it could help if you could give us instances of how columns are coming into play. For instance, like I'm bringing bringing the conversation back to architecture, because actually it's also something we haven't really had a chance to discuss. Like we have today, like we have discussed your presentation, we have discussed other questions, but maybe like the way you would start to make your provocation, Iris and Mia, is by again going back to architecture and what kind of problems that you see in, let's say, the tools of space making that we have. I don't know if that made things worse or better for you, but
is that a rhetorical question or should I actually answer it?
Decide. You can, I think it's best if you try to answer or say something.
I think like throughout this, what after reading Robin Evans and also like other like essays like Corridor Spaces, I think the problem here is not taking care of an old body or like what kind of spaces are for taking care of old bodies, but rather like our understanding of privacy should change from era to era, from time to time. And what we think is that our understanding or acceptance of privacy digitally is very different from how we understand and experience privacy physically. And we do think there's a gap in between those, and we think architecture should catch up that gap because when we're online, we have a much more flexible boundary or like a much more flexible understanding or acceptance of privacy. While like in real life, we don't even think about it. We're stuck with this corridor, wall, room kind of situation, and no one really challenges that. So I think that's why we started to really go down this I don't know, rabbit hole and really try to design all passages, if you will, or like all corridors, if you will.
I think picking up on your response a bit, I think they're like very different conditions of like safety in the digital realm versus the physical realm, right? That you contend with, and like how those, the kind of way that we culturally engage, right? In the digital space and with respect to privacy versus in our physical spaces. But I think then to your response though, I think what then has yet to come across in what I would agree, right? I think this project is both anxiety inducing for myself, but also very beautiful. What hasn't come across in the presentation though are the spectrum and range of programmatic activities and this kind of unpacking of like how that begins to relate to these conditions of loneliness and connectedness and these different and the relationship to privacy. I think it's tough to gauge, right, how successfully the current manifestation, right, of the proposal is grappling with these issues. At least looking at this plan here, right, the residence plan, by just kind of seeing bits of furniture kind of scattered in these arcs, right? I think it's just not quite coming across like how you're grappling with the real nuances of that. I really do like, to Tulay's point, that here in this project, right, we can really like dig in on like a super specific like problem here. I love that. But then I think I would also hope then that we can begin to kind of see like through the presentation, like how you're beginning to unpack and really in a nuanced way address these different conditions, virtuality, physicality, safety, you know, yes, dealing with the issue of age and the ableness of differing bodies. You know, where do you bathe here and how does that work? Can someone always kind of walk up on you like while you're in the shower or bathtub? Maybe that's actually a positive thing for someone who's really elderly and needs like easy access to care. Well, maybe that's something that's quite daunting and challenging for, you know, a family of 4. And how do you negotiate that? I'm not saying that, I'm not criticizing the project for not kind of quote successfully resolving that, but I think you can ask these really focused questions in this beautiful explorations that you were doing. The models that you folks produced were really gorgeous explorations here and like thinking about these forms. And I think where you landed here, I think some of that richness, especially in the section, has been a bit lost, but the conditions where you would like utilize a lot of what you discovered there are very much present.
Any last remarks, comments?
I think we're good, right, Tulay? 4:59.
I just asked if anyone wants to make a last comment. I was mainly asking Ostap.
Oh,
yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, congratulations, guys. I really appreciate all the work you guys have done, and the kind of twists and turns that we took through the project. And to me, I think having been to Japan numerous times and having worked in Japan, and I know you guys both worked in Japan this past summer at Ishigami's office, that there's a certain kind of quality that this project has. To me, I can see it actually working in Japan. There's different kind of norms in terms of privacy that are accepted there, in terms of like public baths and so on and so forth. And so I just want to commend you on the kind of architectural resolution of the project, the formal resolution. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed working with you guys.
And very much same here. And Evan, do you want to do the last, or should I just go ahead and end this?
Yeah, I think we just say thank you to everyone.
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't know exactly how this like all school happy hour thing is going to work, but students should definitely log on. I don't know if the critics got it, but regardless, thanks to everyone. It was an awesome day. I mean, given the environment, it was better than I could have possibly imagined for me personally. I'm sure Cathryn, Tulay, Ostap, and Eva feel the same way. Did Gonzalo ever make it or no?
He didn't, I guess. Yeah, he had an appointment, so maybe he didn't make it back in time.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Eva,
We have the recording.
It was fun to finally be in a section with you. We're always plotting to see each other's work, and the schedule seems to work against us. So, and Tulay, it's really nice to see the project from your section. And, you know, there's some interesting common denominators here too. I see Tulay and Ostap with the public-private questions that your project raised. And of course, Eva, I want to talk to you more later. We'll have a chat about things, but it's really, I just appreciate the jurors today and making maybe a few new friends. And Ed, is Ed still here? Wonderful to have Ed Keller.
Thanks so much. It was awesome. Really great work.
I assume you're in the attic there. Are you in the upper reaches? Yes. Cool. So thank you all for spending the time.
Jason, do you need to say anything? I see you down
Yeah,
there.
I just want to say thank you to all the guest critics, and also especially thank the students. You know, we've said it so many times today, but I think it was sort of an unprecedented semester for students to really pull off their final project during these circumstances, and they all did an amazing job. I'm going to send out the happy hour links, all the critics. We're going to open it in 10 minutes or so, or whatever it is. We'll see how this works, but please log on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Everybody. Cheers.
Thank you.
Be safe.
Cheers. Bye-bye.